Welcome back, brothers to Amalur. Tonight we're diving into the first time Chaos Marines ran into the Tyranids. As always, before we get to the madness, be sure to like and comment in videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get into the madness.
Deep beneath the iron crust of Sybari, where the fortress world's buried manufactoria descended through bedrock like the roots of some diseased mechanical tree, the ammunition lifts had not ceased moving for 19 days. They rose from magazine vaults, sealed behind adamantium shutters and warded blast doors, ascending upon chains thick as a mortal man's torso, while ancient motors growled beneath the weight of war. Pallets of bolt ammunition filled one platform from edge to edge, every brass-cased mass-reactive shell locked into blackened feed crates, stamped with the profaned heraldry of the death shadows. Another lift carried autocannon drums, their linked shells resting beneath layers of preservative grease. Plasma containment cells glowed an unhealthy blue behind protective cages. Crack missiles lay in cradles, attended by lobotomized servitors, whose hands had been replaced by loading clamps and hydraulic manipulators. Some of the machines still wore scraps of human skin around their necks or wrists, where flesh had grown around iron collars over decades of service. None complained. The mechanisms that might once have allowed them to complain had been removed long before. Sybari was preparing for war, and every sound upon the planet proclaimed the certainty that the war would be fought elsewhere. The greatest embarkation vaults beneath the fortress of Karadval were large enough to swallow cathedrals. Rhinos waited in serried ranks beneath ribbed ceilings, blackened by centuries of engine smoke, their armor daubed with warding glyphs, blasphemies, and the red-edged sigil of the death shadows. Predators rested beside them with ammunition hatches open, while mortal armorers crawled across their hulls. Assault craft squatted upon launch cradles farther ahead, armored prows facing cavernous doors that would open into the poisoned skies when the signal came. Hundreds of thousands of slaves moved through the vaults in endless processions, dragging cable reels, fuel hoses, ammunition carts, replacement armor plates, and sealed coffers, whose contents they had been forbidden even to look upon. Overseers walked among them with shock mauls and hooked whips. Those who stumbled were beaten until they rose. Those who could not rise were dragged aside, stripped of anything useful, and thrown onto corpse wagons for rendering. Lord Captain Ver Mordath watched it all from an elevated gantry overlooking the embarkation floor. His power armor was the color of old midnight, the plate scarred and repaired in a dozen places where enemy blades and shells had failed to kill him. Tarnished brass edged his pauldrons. A cloak made from stitched strips of enemy battle standards hung from one shoulder and stirred in the furnace breath, rolling upward from the vault. He stood motionless, while lesser warriors and mortal officers moved around him, his gauntleted hands resting against the railing as he surveyed preparations that had taken years to bring to fruition. Ultramar waited beyond the void. Not knowingly, that was the point. The sons of Guilliman would prepare for fleets, invasions, and declarations of war. They would watch stable translation points and major fleet corridors. They would count capital ships. They would monitor the movements of known renegade hosts and fortify worlds whose names had accumulated meaning over 10,000 years of imperial history. The Death Shadows intended to give them none of those comforts. Mordath had no desire to batter his warriors against prepared fortifications simply because lesser commanders mistook frontal assault for courage. "Third cohort is loaded," said a voice behind him. Mordath turned his helm slightly. Centurion Dravor stood at the entrance to the gantry, an autocannon harness locked against the rear of his armor, and a combat blade hanging beneath one arm. The mortal auxiliaries, still embarking. They are behind schedule. They are mortal. That is an explanation, not an excuse. Dravor's Vox grill emitted a dry mechanical growl that might once have been amusement. Then I shall encourage them. Do so. Below, A slave collapsed beneath an ammunition crate. Another stumbled over him. The crate struck the floor hard enough to split the first man's skull against the deck plating. Blood spilled between the grills beneath the marching column. Nobody stopped. Mordath watched the corpse disappear beneath boots and cartwheels. That was how worlds died. Not always beneath bombardment. Not always beneath banners and screaming orbital assaults. Sometimes they died because a single relay station failed to transmit. Sometimes because a manufacturer's coolant became poison. Sometimes because the commander responsible for a defense grid was found nailed to his own strategium wall before the first shot was fired. Terror was not ornament. Terror was logistics conducted through the human soul. That doctrine had made the death shadows feared across regions where stronger warbands had wasted themselves upon fortress walls. Their planned attack upon Ultramar had been designed accordingly. Astropathic stations would die first, not merely destroyed, but silenced in patterns intended to disguise the shape of the coming assault. Fuel reserves would burn next. Supply convoys would vanish. Water purification systems upon selected worlds had already been mapped. So had orbital defense control nexuses, munitorum depots, administratum archives, and the residences of imperial commanders whose deaths would produce the greatest confusion. Mortal agents had been cultivated and discarded across decades. Captured transponder codes waited inside encrypted cogitator vaults. False distress signals had been prepared in the cant and authentication protocols of imperial shipping. Only after fear and isolation had done their work would the death shadows descend. Mordath looked through the armor glass at the armies below and imagined blue-armored warriors arriving too late to save another burning world. He imagined ultramarine commanders discovering that every distress signal led to another ambush. Every surviving official carried poisoned intelligence. Every terrified population concealed infiltrators or saboteurs. A population was not something to conquer. It was material. Malefor had taught them that long ago. The Sorcerer Lord waited in the strategium at the heart of Caradval, and even among the Death Shadows there were warriors who avoided that chamber whenever duty allowed. Mordath entered without hesitation. The doors opened upon a circular hall sunk deep within the fortress's central bastion. Captured banners hung from the vaulted ceiling, some so ancient their cloth had rotted into strips. Imperial eagles had been broken and inverted along the walls. A shattered aquila, taken from the command bridge of an Imperial cruiser, had been mounted above the central hololith, its two heads severed from the body and impaled upon iron spikes. Beneath it glowed the stellar geometry of Ultramar. Malefor stood inside the projection. The Sorcerer Lord seemed almost carved from the darkness. His armor was covered in script, engraved so densely across the plate that no untouched surface remained. Some inscriptions had been filled with old blood. Others glimmered with colors that changed when viewed from the corner of the eye. A horned helm rested upon the strategium altar beside him, leaving his corpse-pale face exposed. His eyes were black around irises that burned with a low violet luminescence. "The void roots remain favorable," Malefor said without turning. His voice possessed the low resonance of an Astartes, even without amplification, but there was something beneath it, a faint doubling of syllables, as though another speaker whispered from a great distance. "The Corpse Emperor's sons still believe order protects them." Mordath approached the hololith. Order produces patterns, and patterns produce weakness. The relay at Kalth remains the greatest risk. Malefor raised one gauntlet, and the image changed. Lines of light spread between worlds. Then it will not transmit. Destroying it too soon warns them. I did not say destroy it. Mordath studied the projection. Malefor smiled faintly. There are deaths that announce themselves there. There are others that become questions. Questions consume more time. The astropaths? Alive. For a while. Mordath understood. False messages. Contradictions. Warnings without enemies. orders bearing seals whose owners deny issuing them. Let the warriors of Ultramar waste strength determining which fear is real. And when they find the source, then we teach them that knowledge arrived too late. Malifor spoke with the confidence of one describing an event already witnessed. He had always possessed that quality. Centuries of war had taught Mordath to distrust prophecy, but he respected certainty when it was supported by preparation. Malifor had listened to voices beyond reality for longer than many imperial bloodlines had existed. He had summoned things that wore human faces incorrectly. He had spoken names that made mortal listeners claw their own ears from their skulls. He had walked through fire while shapes moved behind him that cast shadows without bodies. If the Empyrean lied to Malifor, it usually did so carefully. The Strategium doors opened again with a scream of protesting mechanisms. Warpsmith Karvek entered trailing the odor of oil, hot metal and burned meat. Thick mechanical limbs rose above his shoulders like the legs of an iron arachnid, each tipped with tools capable of cutting armor plate or peeling flesh from bone. Half his face had disappeared beneath augmetics. One eye burned crimson. Cables entered his jaw where teeth should have been. "You strip Sybari naked," Karvek said. Malifor did not look at him. "Mind your tongue." "My tongue remains organic enough to report what my augurs cannot conceal." Mordath turned. "Speak." Western Defense Grid has surrendered 9 macro-capacitors to the transports. Northern interceptor batteries have been cannibalized for guidance components. 3 ammunition bunkers stand at less than half their ordained reserves because their munitions are aboard your ships. The outer bastions possess enough ammunition to repel raiders, not a fleet action. Malifor finally regarded him. There will be no fleet action here. Machines do not accept prophecy as maintenance. Then it is fortunate machines obey those who do. Karvek's mechadendrites flexed. Sybari is a fortress world. Sybari is a blade, Malifor replied. A blade is wasted while kept within its sheath. Mordath studied Karvek. How long to restore the grid after embarkation is complete? 4 days for partial restoration. Longer if you insist upon removing the reserve generators. We leave before then. I am aware. Malifor turned away. The discussion was finished because he had decided it was finished. Several levels beneath them, condemned prisoners were being marched into a firing gallery. The test chamber had once been an ore processing hall. Now its far wall was layered with ferrocrete and replacement armor slabs, scored by centuries of weapons discharge. 40 prisoners were chained to stakes at measured distances. Some wore remnants of imperial uniforms. Others had once served the death shadows and failed badly enough to deserve instruction in consequences. Dravor stood behind a heavy bolter emplacement while mortal armorers checked the ammunition feed. "Begin," he ordered. The weapon opened fire. The first burst crossed the chamber like thunder imprisoned indoors. Mass reactive shells struck the nearest prisoners and detonated after penetration. Torsos burst open in wet flashes. One man's ribcage vanished into a cloud of bone fragments and blood. Another was struck through the abdomen and folded around the explosion as shredded organs slapped against the wall behind him. A severed arm cartwheeled across the firing lane. The surviving prisoners screamed and strained against chains slick with blood, while servitors recorded penetration, detonation consistency, and feed reliability. Dravor raised a fist. The gun fell silent. "Acceptable." An armorer bowed. "Load the remaining belts." "My lord, those were intended for calibration." Dravor looked at the wounded prisoners. Several still moved. "Then calibration is incomplete." Elsewhere, the fortress prepared with equal devotion. Priests of corrupted machine cults daubed oil and blood across engine housings. Thralls polished armor already clean enough to reflect their frightened faces. Warriors checked bolters, whose mechanisms they had maintained for centuries. Missile racks locked into attack craft. Fuel lines withdrew from armored vehicles one after another as engines ignited and filled the vaults with black exhaust. Above them all, inside one of Caradval's immense aircraft caverns, the Storm Eagle Night Reaver rested upon a launch cradle. Its hull bore the scars of old campaigns beneath fresh black paint. Brass trim followed the aircraft's armored contours. Missile mounts hung beneath the wings, and the barrels of its weapons had been cleaned until they shone beneath the hangar lumens. Serfs crawled over the fuselage, while servitors hauled ammunition beneath its wings. Mordath entered the cavern as one engine coughed into life. The sound shook dust from the ceiling. He approved. Night Reaver had carried death shadows through burning skies before. It had delivered killers into cities whose populations had believed themselves safe behind defense lines. Soon, it would fly beneath the skies of Ultramar. A mortal signal officer approached the gantry beneath Mordath's position. He stopped several paces away and bowed deeply. "My lord." Mordath did not look down. "Speak." "There is interference in the astropathic choir." "What kind?" "The choir master cannot determine it." "Then acquire one who can." The officer swallowed. "He has already lost 2 sensitives." That earned Mordath's attention. "How?" "Seizures. Cerebral hemorrhage in one. The other tore out his own tongue." "During transmission?" "Before transmission, Lord." Mordath stared at him for several seconds. "Inform Malafor." "Yes, Lord." The officer fled. In another tower, far above the embarkation vaults, a slave psyker sat strapped into an iron throne, surrounded by copper conductors. Blood had begun leaking from both nostrils. He whispered that something was pressing against the dark. The overseer struck him. The psyker continued whispering. At the outer auger station, servitors detected a distortion beyond the system's distant reaches. The machine readings were contradictory. Mass, where no registered vessel should exist. Motion, without recognizable drive signatures. Returns spread across such a wide region that the station's cogitators repeatedly classified them as atmospheric corruption, then stellar debris, then instrument error. The lieutenant responsible for the station ordered recalibration. Nobody sounded an alarm. Within the strategium, Malafor began his divination. The chamber had been cleared except for Mordath and 3 bound psykers kneeling around the central altar. Incense rolled from iron braziers. Malafor had cut his palm and allowed blood to fall across the engraved surface. He spoke words Mordath did not recognize, although hearing them caused the muscles beneath his armor to tighten. The hololith dimmed. The air changed. For Malafor, Sybari disappeared. The material universe became distant. He reached beyond it, as he had thousands of times before, opening senses that had damned better men than any who still lived upon Sybari. The Empyrean unfolded around him, infinite and violent, an ocean without water, crowded by desire, rage, hunger, memory, and things that had never possessed mortal names. He sought Ultramar. Something moved. Malafor's breath stopped. Not a demon, not a god, not a soul. Pressure descended across the immaterium with such immensity that for one impossible instant, Malafor could perceive nothing else. The familiar currents vanished beneath it. Voices he had known for centuries were gone. The warp itself seemed smothered beneath a presence without words, without temptation, without laughter. Something vast occupied the darkness, vaster, closer. Malafor tore himself free. The 3 slave psykers died with him. One simply collapsed. Another convulsed so violently that his spine snapped against the restraints. The third opened his mouth and vomited blood across the altar before his eyes burst red inside their sockets. Mordath drew his bolt pistol. Malafor stood hunched over the altar, both hands pressed against the metal. "My lord." No answer. "Malafor." The sorcerer lord slowly raised his head. Before either warrior spoke, every Vox unit in the strategium shrieked. Static filled the chamber. Then a voice emerged, weak, Broken. Mail. Karadval. This is Outer Station Karen. Priority transmission. Unknown contacts entering Auger range. Repeat. Unknown contacts. No engine signatures. Biological readings impossible. Mass estimates exceed. Static swallowed the words. Mordath stepped toward the Vox console. Karen, clarify. Only screaming interference answered. Then, briefly, the distant officer returned. They are alive. The transmission ended. Silence settled over the strategium. Mordath looked toward Malifor. The sorcerer had not moved. His eyes remained fixed upon nothing Mordath could see. What approaches Sybari? Malifor said nothing. It was the silence that disturbed Mordath first. Malifor always possessed an answer. Truth, lie, prophecy, threat, contempt. It mattered little. Uncertainty belonged to mortals. Malifor. The Sorcerer Lord finally looked at him. For the first time in all the centuries, Ver Mordath had served beneath his command. There was no arrogance in Malifor's face. Only something perilously close to fear. I do not know. For several heartbeats after Malifor spoke, nothing moved within the strategium. The words seemed to possess a greater weight than any alarm rune or tactical warning, not because of what they revealed, but because of who had uttered them. Sorcerer Lord Malifor had named demons that could strip sanity from mortal men. He had stared into warp storms and returned bearing prophecies written in blood. He had stood upon the command decks of burning ships while the immaterium tore itself open around him, and had laughed at things lesser minds could not perceive without madness. Yet now he stood over the corpses of 3 slave psychers, with their blood spreading beneath his boots, and confessed ignorance. Mordath felt the admission settle through him like cold metal. Outside the strategium, deeper alarms began to sound through Karadval. At first they came as isolated warning tones from the outer auger arrays, then as overlapping klaxons from communications towers, navigation shrines, and astropathic chambers. The fortress responded as if stabbed in a dozen organs at once. Vox servitors began repeating error catechisms. Cogitator banks spat streams of corrupted data across pict screens. Mortal operators shouted over one another. And beneath all those mechanical failures, something else entered Sybari, something no siren had been built to announce. Men began clutching their heads. The first to fall were the sensitives. Astropaths convulsed in their iron thrones, bodies arching against restraint harnesses, while blood seeped from eyes, nostrils, and ears. Bound psychers in Malifor's ritual vaults screamed until their throats split. One tore loose 3 fingernails trying to claw symbols into the stone floor before a ward servitor crushed his hands beneath an iron foot. Another began speaking in 6 overlapping voices, none of them coherent, before biting through his own tongue and drowning in the blood. Even mortals without sanctioned psychic ability suffered. Servants stumbled through corridors with sudden migraines, vomiting against bulkheads. Priests of corrupted cults forgot half-remembered invocations. Men awoke from brief periods of unconsciousness, convinced that something enormous had leaned over them in the dark. The sensation was not a voice, and not a presence in the ordinary sense. It was pressure, an ocean descending upon the skull, a weight behind thought. Malifor felt it more keenly than any of them. The warp, which had always existed around him as naturally as air existed around lesser beings, had become thick and hostile. He reached for familiar currents and found them choked. He called inwardly toward entities whose whispers had accompanied him for centuries, and heard only a distant roar, vast enough to drown gods beneath it. "Seal the astropathic vaults," Mordath ordered. "No one enters or leaves without my command." A mortal communications prefect bowed so quickly that his forehead almost struck his console. "My lord, the choir is attempting retransmission." "To whom?" "Every allied frequency we possess. The Verix Compact, the Carrion Brotherhood, the Renegade Station at Vorda's Wake, all long-range channels." "And?" The prefect hesitated. "Nothing returns." Mordath's helm tilted fractionally. Nothing? Static, Lord. Or less than static. The machine spirits register transmission, but the empiric relays do not carry it. The astropaths say they cannot see beyond the system. Then use conventional channels. We have. Long-range Vox is degrading. Navigation beacons are losing lock. Several orbital stations report star fixes inconsistent with their own charts. Karvek moved to the nearest console and shoved the mortal operator aside hard enough to fracture the man's shoulder. The warpsmith plugged a mechadendrite directly into the cogitator housing. Data poured across his retinal augmetic in streams too fast for an unmodified eye to follow. "The instruments are not failing," he said. Mordath looked at him. "Then what is?" "The assumptions by which they interpret what they see." Karvek seized control of the Strategium hololith. The projection of Ultramar vanished, replaced by Sybari's system. At first, only a handful of red threat runes appeared near the outer reaches. Then several became dozens. Dozens became hundreds. Each contact blinked uncertainly as classification subroutines fought one another. Debris, unknown vessel, sensor ghost, biological mass, stellar interference, unknown vessel, debris again. Karvek snarled and increased resolution. The cogitator protested, symbols multiplying until they layered over one another. "No drive emissions," he said. "No plasma wake. No engine signatures matching Imperial, Xenos, or Renegade archives. Mass readings inconsistent. Some contacts are smaller than escorts. Others exceed conventional capital classifications. Their vectors are coordinated, but there are no detectable propulsion systems." "Imperial deception," one of the Death Shadow's lieutenants said from the perimeter of the chamber. "Camellia line screens. False auger returns." Karvek turned his red eye upon him. "Do you imagine Gilliman's whelps have learned to disguise a battle barge as living tissue? Then an alien migration. Aliens do not migrate in attack formation." Another warrior looked toward Malifaux, or something summoned. The chamber became still again. Malifaux's eyes narrowed. The warrior had not named him. He did not need to. "Choose your next words with care," Malifaux said. The lieutenant bowed his helm. "I speak only of possibility, Lord. There are possibilities permitted to lesser minds, and possibilities forbidden to them." Karvek cut across the exchange before pride could become murder. "I can provide certainty." He transmitted a command to Sybari's outermost surviving observatory. Servitors rotated ancient telescopic arrays toward the threat, while cogitators stripped away interference one layer at a time. The first image arrived blurred and trembling, a darkness against darkness. Then the machine sharpened it. No one spoke. The shape upon the pict feed was not a ship. It was too organic for the word. A colossal thing drifted through the void, with a body protected by overlapping plates resembling the carapace of some abyssal beast. Vast ridges ran along its flanks. Cavities opened where gun decks should have been, except those cavities flexed. Limb-like structures curled beneath the creature's mass. Smaller shapes swarmed around it in numbers the magnification could not resolve cleanly, each moving with subtle corrections that suggested instinct rather than thrusters. Another immense organism passed behind the first, then another. The feed widened. There were hundreds in that single field of view. One Death Shadow whispered, "What in damnation?" Mordath did not rebuke him. For once, the phrase required no embellishment. "Record every image," he ordered. "Cross-reference all Xenos archives. No assumptions. No names we have not earned." Karvek's augmetic clicked as he searched. No match. "Then we fight what is before us." The old discipline returned to Mordath immediately. Ignorance was dangerous. Panic was fatal. Whatever the creatures were, they occupied space, possessed mass, and approached upon predictable trajectories. Anything with a trajectory could be ambushed. Anything with mass could be destroyed. Extinguish non-essential emissions across the northern hemisphere. Shut down exposed beacons. Order orbital batteries to remain cold until targets enter predetermined kill volumes. Transmit false drive signatures from the western defense moons. Scatter them. Make Sybari appear weaker on one axis and stronger on another. Deploy interceptor craft beneath the southern magnetic shadow. Engines minimal until launch command. Move reserve armor away from embarkation vaults and into hardened positions. Karvek's mechadendrites twitched. You are building a kill box. I am offering them a weakness. You assume they recognize one. They came here, therefore they recognize prey. Mordath turned toward the communications pits. Open broad-spectrum channels. The prefect looked confused. To the contacts, to everything approaching us. A low hum passed through the strategium as transmission arrays awakened. Mordath selected recordings from the Death Shadow's archive of terror. Screams taken from captured Imperial officers, corrupted hymns sung during planetary massacres, the final vox traffic of cities they had destroyed. Over it all, he dictated a message in High Gothic, then repeated it in several Xenos trade cants and corrupted machine code. He named Sybari. He named the Death Shadows. He promised annihilation to anything entering weapons range. He described prisoners flayed alive and commanders crucified above the gates of conquered fortresses. He invoked powers whose names had driven mortal governors to suicide before Death Shadow's fleets ever reached orbit. The message crossed the void. Nothing answered. Mordath sent it again. No reply. No change in vector. No shift in formation. No counter-threat. No demand. No plea. No challenge. The living ships continued toward Sybari. Dravor had entered the strategium during the transmission. He stood behind Mordath now, armor smelling faintly of propellant from the firing gallery. Perhaps they did not understand. They understood enough to come here, Mordath said. Then perhaps they do not fear. A colder silence followed that. Every enemy feared something. Imperial guardsmen feared death. Governors feared disgrace. Space Marines feared failure, even when they denied fearing anything else. Demons feared greater demons. Sorcerers feared patrons. Champions feared weakness. And even slaves who had endured generations beneath the Death Shadows feared the whip because pain could still reach them. Terror was not merely emotion. It was leverage. Mordath had built campaigns upon that certainty. The things in the void gave him nothing. Malifaux suddenly moved away from the hololith. Clear the chamber. Mordath turned. Why? I will know them. Karvek gave a harsh metallic laugh. Your last attempt killed 3 psychers. They were vessels made of rotting meat. They were instruments. And I require better instruments. Malifaux strode toward the ritual alcove at the rear of the strategium. Mortal attendants hurried to bring censers, sacrificial blades and sealed reliquaries. Mordath watched him. You said the warp was obscured. Malifaux stopped. I said no such thing. You said you did not know what approached. That is not the same. His gauntleted hand trembled. Only once. Mordath saw it. Malifaux saw him see it. The Sorcerer Lord's expression hardened. Remain if you wish to witness understanding. No one left. Fresh slave psychers were dragged into the chamber. One began shrieking before the first restraint closed around his wrist. Another begged Malifaux not to open the way, insisting that there was no way anymore, only teeth behind the dark. Malifaux ignored him. Symbols were drawn. Blood was spilled. Incense thickened until the strategium smelled of iron and grave soil. Then Malifaux reached outward. This time he went deeper. The warp resisted him like congealed blood. Familiar currents dragged against his mind. Distance lost meaning. Sound became pressure. He pushed harder, invoking old covenants, forcing his consciousness through the psychic suffocation surrounding Sybari. For a fraction of a second, he broke through and touched the thing beyond. There were no minds. There were too many minds. The distinction vanished. He perceived claws tearing through atmospheres upon worlds he had never seen, mouths opening by the billion, cells dividing, eggs splitting, wings beating inside poisoned skies, organisms killing because killing was movement and movement was hunger. Countless impulses moved within one direction, each separate and not separate, every creature a finger upon an immeasurable hand. He searched for a soul and found only the totality. He searched for intention and found consumption. He searched for hatred and found none. The absence of hatred terrified him. Malefor recoiled. His scream cracked lumen globes across the chamber. 2 slave psychers died instantly. The third burst blood from every opening in his face and collapsed against the altar. Malefor staggered backward, one gauntlet clawing at his own helmless head. Violet fire crawled across his armor. Mordath stepped toward him. "What did you see?" Malefor looked up. "Hunger. What are they?" "I know them." Mordath waited. Malefor's breathing slowed. "I know them. You have said that. They are..." His eyes moved toward the ceiling, as though tracking something beyond it. "They are nothing. Beasts. A swarm. Lesser than beasts." Karvek's red eye narrowed. "That is not what your face says." Malefor's head snapped toward him. Silence. "No one spoke," Mordath said. Malefor stared at him. The chamber froze. Mordath slowly realized the sorcerer was not looking at Karvek anymore. He was looking toward a Death Shadows warrior standing beside the western archway. "You," Malefor said. The warrior looked behind himself, then back. "Lord, I warned you." "My lord, I have said nothing." Malefor raised one hand. The warrior's body slammed against the stone wall hard enough to crack ceramite. Before he could rise, violet force compressed around him. His breastplate buckled inward. There came a wet crunch from beneath the armor as ribs shattered and drove through his lungs. Blood burst from his vox grill. Mordath moved between them. "Enough." Malefor's hand remained raised. The crushed warrior slid down the wall, dead. For several seconds, Malefor looked at the corpse, as though uncertain how it had come to be there. Then, every defense alarm on Sybari began sounding at once. Karvek tore his attention toward the hololith. "Contacts accelerating." Mordath turned. "Weapons? Unknown. Range? Closing." The first living projectiles struck Sybari's outer orbital stations seconds later. The hololith erupted with damage runes. One station vanished immediately, its final picked burst, showing something enormous, punching through armor glass and bulkheads in a spray of metal, atmosphere, and human bodies. Another platform reported impacts across its hull before the transmission dissolved into screaming. Beyond them, immense organic vessels opened cavities along their bodies and expelled swarms of smaller shapes toward the planet. "Fire," Mordath said. Sybari answered. Hidden batteries awakened across the system. Lance emplacements spat coherent beams into the void. Macro-scale ordnance thundered from defense platforms. Missile salvos erupted from concealed silos and accelerated toward the approaching mass. For several glorious seconds, the darkness became fire. Living ships died. One immense organism was struck by repeated lance impacts along its flank. Carapace vaporized. Internal tissue exploded outward in steaming clouds that froze almost instantly in vacuum. Another was pierced from bow to stern by heavy ordnance, its body rupturing into great slabs of flesh and armored shell. Smaller organisms vanished by the hundreds beneath missile detonations. A creature larger than an Imperial cruiser lost half its mass and continued drifting forward, while lesser shapes swarmed around its corpse. Warriors in the Strategium began voicing kill confirmations. Karvek did not join them. More threat runes appeared. Then more. The outer projection filled with crimson symbols faster than the cogitators could assign designations. Destroyed contacts disappeared, only to be replaced by 10, 20, 50 new returns advancing behind them. The hololith expanded scale automatically. The crimson multiplied. It expanded again. The system display became so crowded that individual runes merged together. "Machine error," Dravor said. Carvex mechadendrites were utterly still. No. Then recalibrate. I have. The projection flickered. Warning text appeared across the system map. The cogitator could no longer render separate contacts. It collapsed them into broader threat fields. Red spread across the void. One field became three. Three joined another. Soon the outer system was no longer marked with ships at all, but with a single advancing crimson stain. A mortal officer stared upward, face drained of color. No fleet can possess that many vessels. From the darkness beyond the hololith came Malefor's voice. It is not a fleet. Malefor would not withdraw. Mordath knew it before the Sorcerer Lord spoke, knew it from the way Malefor stood beneath the dead glow of the Strategium hololith, with one hand resting upon the blood-blackened altar, and the other flexing slowly at his side. The great projection of the Sybari system had become an ulcer of warning light. Red threat fields pressed inward from every vector. Defense stations burned as tiny runes along the system's edge. Vox traffic came in broken fragments, voices fighting static, commanders requesting. Confirmation of orders no one remembered issuing. Beneath all of it, deeper than alarm tones and weapons reports, the shadow continued to thicken. Mordath could not feel it as Malefor did, not truly, but even his transhuman senses registered the consequences. Mortal operators sweated despite the cold. Servitors paused half a second too long between commands. The remaining bound psychers whimpered through stitched mouths. Malefor alone stood in apparent stillness, and that stillness had become more dangerous than movement. "You will not attempt another communion," Mordath said. Malefor turned his head by degrees. The chamber fell silent around them. Mordath had not phrased the words as a request. For an instant, something old and murderous passed behind Malefor's eyes. "You forget yourself. I remember Sybari. You presume to instruct me upon the warp? I presume to observe what it has done to you." Several death shadows shifted their weight. None spoke. The rigid hierarchy of the warband had survived betrayals, campaigns, rivalries, and centuries of accumulated hatred, because everyone understood where power lay. To challenge Malefor openly was not merely insolence. It was a declaration that the old order might already be dead. Malefor straightened. "The Empyrean does not belong to these creatures." "No," Mordath replied, "yet you cannot hear beyond them." A muscle tightened in Malefor's jaw. To recoil now is submission. To whom? To whatever presses upon us. Mordath stepped closer to the altar. There is no shame in changing weapons when one fails. Spoken like a butcher of flesh. Spoken like one who intends to survive long enough to kill the enemy. Malefor's eyes flared violet. "And what do you imagine survival is, Ver? A tally of heartbeats? Centuries piled upon centuries until your armor rusts around you? No. Survival is dominion, will, the refusal to be diminished." He looked across the warriors assembled within the sanctum. "If I turn from the warp because some nameless swarm fouls its currents, then every oath I have made becomes a lie. Every spirit that watches becomes witness to weakness. Every god that has ever granted favor learns that Malefor can be driven from his own throne." "There are no gods in this room," Carvex said. Malefor looked toward him. The warpsmith's augmetic eye glowed like a furnace coal. "Only enemies and malfunction." For a heartbeat, Mordath expected Malefor to kill him. Instead, the Sorcerer Lord smiled. It was worse. "Prepare the circle." The attendants obeyed. Mortal hands trembled as braziers were relit and chains drawn through floor rings. Black candles guttered beneath the ventilation currents. 3 fresh psychers were dragged forward from the holding cells, though one had to be carried because his legs had stopped working. Another laughed continuously in a thin, broken voice and kept asking whether the stars were hungry. The third was silent until he saw Malefor. Then he began pleading. "Not again, Lord, not again. It sees through us. It sees through all of us." Malefor struck him with the back of one gauntlet. The Psyker's lower jaw came away in a spray of teeth and blood. Then let it look. The ritual began. Mordath remained because leaving would achieve nothing. Karvek remained because he trusted instruments more than omens, but trusted Malefor even less. Dravor stood near the archway with one hand resting against the grip of his sidearm. Around them, the command sanctum continued receiving reports from a world beginning to lose contact with itself. Malefor drew a blade across his palm. Blood struck the altar. The air thickened. This time there was no gradual descent, no careful opening of psychic perception, no patient search through the immaterium. Malefor plunged. The warp met him like a wall. He forced himself through it. The first sensation was pressure, then multiplicity, then the collapse of meaning. A billion impulses touched him at once. Claw, heat, air, hunger, motion, scent, prey, darkness, light, pressure, bone, blood, distance, brood, command, consume. The impressions were not words, but Malefor's mind translated because it had no other means of surviving them. Yet every translation was wrong. He searched for speakers and found none. Searched for separate minds and found too many. A creature falling through Sybari's upper atmosphere was itself, and something else, and part of something greater. A living vessel beyond the moon tasted magnetic fields through organs larger than fortress towers. Burrowing things curled inside impact cysts. Winged organisms spasmed within membranes that would soon split open. Minds nested within minds nested within direction. Malefor reached for himself. There was no edge. His memories flashed through the torrent and became contaminated by it. The burning of an imperial shrine world. The face of a captain he had strangled centuries ago. The first demon whose true name he had learned. The taste of ash on another planet, under another sky. Then each memory acquired claws. His own name ceased to sound singular. Malefor, Malefor, Malefor. The syllables multiplied until they were meaningless noise beneath the pressure of countless alien impulses, each creature distinct in body and irrelevant in purpose. Something immeasurably vast did not speak to him because it had no need to speak. It did not recognize him as rival, prophet or enemy. His sorcery, his titles, his victories, his promises to the gods, the centuries of slaughter behind his name, all of it passed beneath the weight of an intelligence that categorized him only as resistance and flesh. He screamed inside the warp. A million mouths opened, not in answer, in hunger. Malefor tore himself free. The ritual circle exploded. The nearest psyker struck the ceiling hard enough to burst his skull. Brain matter and bone fragments scattered across the engraved stone before the corpse fell limp over the altar. The second was flung sideways into an armored pillar. His body folded around it with a crack of spine and ribs, then slid downward, leaving a thick red smear. The third remained upright for one impossible instant, while violet flame burned through his eyes and mouth. Then his chest split from within, ribs pushing outward through scorched flesh, before he collapsed in pieces. Attendants died without understanding why. One servant was lifted bodily and hurled across the sanctum, striking a death shadow in the breastplate with enough force to reduce his skull and chest to red ruin. Another ignited where he stood. His skin blackened, then peeled away in strips while he ran 3 steps before crashing into a brazier. A third clawed at his own face as sorcerous fire entered his mouth and burned through the back of his head. Malefor stood at the center. His eyes were open. They did not appear to see the room. "Western bastions," he said. Mordath raised one hand toward the communications pit. An operator straightened. "Awaiting command. Fire all batteries." The operator hesitated. "At what target, Lord?" Malefor turned toward the western wall. "There. There are no contacts over the western bastions." "Fire," Mordath said. "Hold." Malefor's head snapped toward him. "Fire. Hold," Mordath repeated. The operator froze between them. Malifaux stepped away from the altar. Fortress Val-Karan will extinguish all emissions. Absolute silence. No launch activity. Mordath looked toward another station. Confirm. A mortal officer checked the rune feed. Val-Karan already received launch orders, Lord. 2 assault wings are preparing departure. I ordered silence, Malifaux said. You ordered launch, Mordath replied. Malifaux stared at him. No. You did. No. Karvek moved to the hololith and began pulling command traffic into view. Both orders bear your cipher. Then the cipher lies. Machines do not invent your voice. Malifaux raised his hand. A dark shape flickered along the wall. He turned and struck. Sorcerer's force smashed into the stone. The wall cracked from floor to ceiling. An attendant standing nearby disappeared inside the impact, his body crushed so completely that blood sprayed outward through the shattered masonry. There, Malifaux said. Mordath looked at the ruined wall. There is nothing there. It moved. Nothing moved. Malifaux's gauntlet shook again. This time it did not stop. Recall the 3rd assault cohort, he said. They were recalled 6 minutes ago, Drevor replied. Then deploy them to the southern works. They have already begun redeployment to the eastern vaults. Who commanded that? You did. Malifaux whirled. Violet light gathered around. His hands. The nearest death shadow barely had time to raise his bolter. Malifaux struck him with invisible force. The warrior hit the floor on one knee. His breastplate groaned inward. Ceramite cracked. The warrior roared through his vox grill and tried to rise. Malifaux clenched his fist. The armor collapsed around the warrior's torso. There was a wet series of pops beneath the plate as ribs shattered and organs burst. Blood ran from the warrior's gorget in heavy streams. One gauntlet scraped against the floor, fingers gouging lines into stone, then went still. Mordath drew his bolt pistol. Every warrior in the chamber saw it. No one moved. Malifaux looked at the weapon. You threaten me? I preserve command. You would murder your lord? If necessary. The words settled like iron. Malifaux smiled again, but there was no recognition in it. You think command resides in rank. It resides wherever orders still possess meaning. Karvek turned from the hololith. Then command must change now. The chamber erupted into argument. Lord Hadrak, master of the warband's remaining assault craft, demanded immediate launch. The orbit is not yet sealed. We have vessels capable of translation if we break from the system before the living ships close. And navigate through what? Karvek demanded. The warp is blind. Better blindness than digestion. Drevor slammed one gauntlet against the strategium table. Flight divides us and surrenders the fortresses. We hold the ground. Against what? Hadrak snarled. You have seen the augurs. We have ammunition. Not enough. We have killed worlds with less. A lieutenant named Vargul stepped forward, his armor covered in parchment strips, inked with prayers to powers he believed watched every wound he inflicted. Cowards, all of you. The gods have sent judgment. Karvek turned his augmetic gaze upon him. Your gods did not appear on my augurs. They do not require your machines. Everything requires my machines when it wants ammunition. Vargul bared his teeth. This swarm is trial. We meet it in the open. Let the powers see who is worthy. Mordath almost killed him for stupidity, but the proposal already had supporters. Several warriors growled assent. Enough. His voice silenced them. We do not launch blind. We do not abandon fortified ground. We do not charge an unidentified enemy for the amusement of entities that have offered no instruction. We centralize planetary defense. All cohorts fall beneath a single command net. Armor disperses from embarkation vaults. Aircraft are preserved until target corridors are identified. Heavy weapons move to prepared fields of fire. Every fortress reports ammunition, personnel, operational guns, and breach status. Hadrak stared at him. By whose authority? Mordath looked at Malifaux. The Sorcerer Lord had turned away from them. He was staring upward. Beyond the fortress roof, the upper atmosphere of Sybari was beginning to change. Picked feeds showed the first thickening clouds. At first they appeared meteorological, vast stains spreading through the poisoned sky. Then orbital auspex resolved particulate matter, descending in quantities no natural storm could produce. Spores, organic debris, living fragments, impact signatures began appearing over the northern continent, then the southern wastes, then the fortress belts around Caradval. One impact became 10, 10 became hundreds. Orbital guns continued firing, but the defensive geometry was already collapsing beneath saturation. Living vessels died above Sybari, and still more advanced. Smaller organisms passed between burning hulks. Great biological masses descended through the atmosphere wrapped in flame. The swarm did not understand that Sybari's commanders were arguing. It did not need to. Its timing was simply perfect, because its purpose was singular. A Vox channel opened suddenly. "Command, this is Listening Fortress Dral." The signal was ragged. Mordath seized it. "Report. Impacts outside the northern perimeter. We believe them wreckage. They are not wreckage." Gunfire cracked in the background. Bolters. Then something shrieked. "Not human. Describe." "Fast. Low. 6 limbs on some. Emperor's corpse. There are—" A roar of automatic fire drowned him. Someone screamed over the Vox. Another voice shouted, "Inside the wire! Inside the—" A wet, tearing sound followed. Then bolter fire again, closer this time. 1 shot, 2. Silence. Mordath waited. "Dral!" Static. "Dral! Respond!" Something scraped across the open Vox pickup. Then came a sound like jaws closing around meat. The channel died. No one argued after that. Mordath turned from the console. "All forces acknowledge my command." Hadric said nothing. Dravor bowed his head. Karvek transmitted the order before anyone else could object. Across Sybari, the Death Shadows began trying to become a defensive army. They were too late. Half their war gear was still configured for embarkation. Heavy weapon batteries had been stripped from fortress mounts and packed for transport. Missile reserves sat in concentrated staging depots beside fuel bladders and assault craft. Armored vehicles were arranged in loading columns instead of dispersed behind revetments. Mortal auxiliaries remained crowded into embarkation vaults, where a single breach could turn tens of thousands of bodies into a killing ground. Aircraft sat fueled wingtip to wingtip beneath hangar roofs. Ammunition that should have been distributed across hardened positions had been gathered into neat, efficient mountains designed for rapid loading. Everything required for an invasion had become everything an attacker would wish to find. Mordath understood it all in one glance at the tactical projections. He had spent years sharpening Sybari into a blade pointed at Ultramar. Now something had seized the hand holding it. A thunderous impact rolled through Caradval. Dust fell from the ceiling. The hololith flickered. Outside, through the armored observation apertures high above the strategium, streaks of fire crossed the sky in growing numbers. Some burned white, others green. Some split apart during descent and became multiple falling bodies. Mordath looked toward Malifaux. The Sorcerer Lord was still staring upward. For a moment, his face changed. The madness receded. Not completely, but enough. Enough for the ancient intelligence to return. Enough for Mordath to recognize his lord again. Malifaux watched the burning sky. "When men hate you," he said quietly, "they grant you shape." Mordath said nothing. Hatred is recognition. Fear is recognition. Vengeance, pride, even contempt. Malifaux's voice had become almost calm. All of them require the enemy to exist. Another impact shook the fortress. Malifaux looked at Mordath. There was blood beneath his eyes. "What comes for us has no hatred." For the first time since the alarms began, Mordath felt something colder than calculation move through him. Malifaux turned back toward the sky. "That is why it will not stop." 1 minute after the first confirmed ground contact, the northern approaches to Karadval disappeared beneath fire. The first mycetic organisms had struck beyond the fortress walls like meteors, punching craters into black rock and ferrocrete, hard enough to throw slabs of masonry higher than the battlements. Some burst open on impact, others split along pulsing seams seconds later, wet membranes peeling apart, while steam and alien fluids hissed across the ground. What came out of them moved too quickly for mortal eyes. 6-limbed shapes poured from ruptured shells in shrieking packs, clawed feet striking sparks from stone as they raced toward gun emplacements. Larger beasts followed in their wake, hunched beneath ridged carapaces and carrying weapons that were not carried at all, but grown into their forelimbs, flesh fused seamlessly with barrel-like organs and pulsing ammunition sacks. Above them descended clouds of winged things, leathery membranes beating against air, already thick with spores and smoke. Sybari's sky had become a burning ceiling alive with movement. Mordath stood upon the eastern command bastion, with one boot planted against the shattered parapet, and watched the first wave come within range. He did not order immediate fire. Mortal gunners below him had already begun shouting target reports, their voices sharpened by terror, but the death shadows remained motionless behind prepared firing steps. Bolters were shouldered, autocannon barrels tracked, missile launchers adjusted by fractions. Dravor's havocs waited among them, statues of midnight armor framed by ammunition crates and the red glare of emergency lumens. The swarm raced, closer. Mordath watched distance runes fall across his visor display. He could hear claws now, thousands of them, scraping stone like knives drawn across bone. Hold! A mortal officer beside him breathed too quickly. The nearest creatures crossed another marker. Hold! One of the beasts leapt atop a ruined bunker and screamed. Its jaws opened wider than any terrestrial predator's should, revealing rows of hooked teeth slick with translucent saliva. Mordath lowered his bolt pistol. Kill them! The fortress answered with thunder. Bolter volleys struck the front ranks and turned bodies inside out. Mass reactive shells punched through chitin before detonating within torsos, bursting alien ribs and organs across the ground in steaming arcs. One creature lost its head and 3 limbs in a single overlapping volley, yet continued forward for 2 more strides before collapsing into the bodies racing behind it. Autocannons opened from elevated positions, their heavier shells smashing through larger organisms and throwing pieces of armored flesh backward into the swarm. Lascannon beams stabbed from recessed casemates and bored incandescent holes through creatures that had survived everything else. Missile trails crossed overhead. A salvo landed among a dense brood, pressing through a breach in the outer wall, and lifted the entire formation in a red-black blossom of dirt, fire, and fragments. Then the flamers began. Promethium washed through the approach trenches in sheets. Creatures vanished behind walls of orange-white fire. Chitin cracked under heat. Limbs curled. Wing membranes shriveled and tore. Burning organisms continued running for astonishing distances before muscle finally failed, and even then others clambered over them, catching fire from the bodies beneath. The trenches became channels of burning meat. The mortal defenders began cheering. At first, Mordath ignored them. Then the sound spread from one position to another, until men who had been vomiting from fear minutes earlier were pounding rifle stocks against battlements and shouting toward the oncoming swarm. "They bleed!" The cry passed down the wall. "They bleed! They bleed!" A death shadow beside Mordath fired 3 measured bolter shots and reduced a charging organism's skull to wet fragments. "Everything bleeds!" Dravor's autocannon roared. A larger beast staggered as shells walked up its torso, each impact blasting chunks from its carapace. The final round entered through the throat and tore the rear of its neck apart in a burst of dark fluid. Dravor watched it fall. And everything dies. For several minutes, it seemed he was right. The death shadows had fought wars across centuries, and the habits of those centuries asserted themselves with terrible efficiency. They did not waste ammunition on wounded prey when fresh targets advanced behind it. They changed magazines beneath cover. They overlapped fields of fire without command prompts. When one heavy weapon overheated, another shifted to cover its sector before the first gunner asked. Mortal troops, who would have broken under the assault instead, found themselves fighting inside the architecture of Astartes' discipline. Officers screamed corrections, servitors fed ammunition, gunners learned to aim at the bases of leaping creatures so that the detonations threw them into those behind. Kill zones filled until the dead lay several bodies deep. Mordath watched and measured. The enemy was fast. Some organisms were fragile enough that disciplined bolter fire tore them apart easily. Others required heavier weapons. A few carried natural armor capable of turning lesser rounds. None appeared afraid. None slowed because the creatures beside them died. They attacked as though death had no meaning at all. That was the first thing he marked. The second was worse. The initial assault had not been intended to succeed. The realization came when ammunition tallies began reaching him. Bolter expenditure at the northern wall had already exceeded projection. 2 autocannon nests had burned through almost a quarter of their ready drums. Flame of fuel was falling faster than replenishment crews could move it through damaged access corridors. The Tyranids had died in mountains, but the red mass beyond those mountains had not diminished. Fresh organisms appeared through the smoke. They did not follow the same paths. The first broods had rushed directly toward the strongest concentrations of fire. The next shifted along the dead ground between bastions. Some disappeared into shell craters and drainage cuts. Others turned toward maintenance structures Mordath had considered tactically irrelevant. Winged organisms stopped attacking the highest towers and instead struck ammunition runners moving between positions. A cluster of smaller beasts ignored an open firing lane entirely and vanished beneath a collapsed transit bridge. Mordath's helm display marked their vectors. "They are mapping us," he said. Dravor fired again. "By dying, by making us shoot." A mortal officer looked at him. "My lord." The first wave located our guns. The officer's face changed. Mordath opened the command net. All positions, alter firing geometry. Secondary nests remain cold until designated. Do not illuminate reserve weapons merely because targets present themselves. Priority to creatures demonstrating command behavior. There was a pause. Dravor asked, "Command behavior?" Mordath had already noticed them. They came behind the lesser organisms, taller, heavier. Not necessarily the largest beasts on the field, but different in bearing. Their movement possessed purpose that the others lacked. One advanced through the eastern rubble with a blade-like crest rising from its armored skull. Lesser creatures around it changed almost instantly. Packs that had been running in loose animalistic clusters tightened into coordinated lines. Some spread outward, others dropped behind cover. A brood that had been throwing itself uselessly against a fortified gun slit suddenly divided, half continuing the attack, while the remainder moved toward the bunker flank. Mordath magnified the image. "Dravor. I see it. The crested one." The Havoc captain's autocannon traversed. 3 rounds struck the creature before it could turn. The first cracked outer carapace. The second drove through the fracture. The third detonated somewhere inside its upper torso. The beast folded as if its strings had been cut. What followed was immediate. The smaller organisms around it faltered. Not all of them, not completely, but the change was unmistakable. Several broke formation. One turned in a circle, snapping at another creature. A pack attempting to flank the bunker lost cohesion and rushed directly into a pre-sighted bolter lane. Mordath's eyes narrowed. There, Dravor understood. The larger beasts direct them. Not by Vox. Then by what? It does not matter. Kill them. The order spread. Marksmen began searching the swarm for creatures whose presence altered lesser broods. Havocs redirected heavy weapons. Lascanon teams ignored closer targets to strike taller organisms moving behind the front. The effect was brutal and measurable. Wherever the strange command beasts died, local assaults staggered. Mortal gunners began exploiting the hesitation, cutting down disordered packs by the score. For the first time since the invasion began, Mordath felt the shape of a solution. Not victory, a method. Methods could become victories. "Mark every beast producing the effect," he ordered. "Cross-reference all picked feeds. Establish visual traits. Inform every fortress still answering." Karvek's voice came through the vox, fractured by interference. "Already compiling. Carapace structures differ. Cranial development appears disproportionate in several specimens. There may be multiple control forms. Then identify all of them. I require intact corpses. Acquire them after we remain alive." A burst of static swallowed Karvek's reply. The assault changed again. 7 minutes after first contact, another crested organism appeared behind the corpse of the first. Dravor killed it. A third emerged farther back. A Lascanon team struck it through the chest. Then Mordath saw a fourth, a fifth, 2 more moving along the opposite wall. The tactic still worked. It simply did not work quickly enough. Each command beast that died disrupted a portion of the swarm, but another replaced it. Sometimes 2. Sometimes the lesser organisms remained coordinated because a second controlling creature had been hidden behind the first. The hierarchy was not a chain. It was a web. Behemoth had redundancy. Mordath had ammunition. The distinction became unbearable. "Eastern Bastion!" someone shouted over the vox. "Breach! Breach at the lower gallery!" Mordath turned. A section of the outer wall had disappeared beneath bodies, not collapsed, buried. Tyranid corpses had piled against the ferrocrete until the mound reached the lower firing apertures. Fresh creatures scrambled upward over their own dead. Heavy bolters fired point-blank into them, detonating skulls and torsos, but every corpse remained where it fell, making the slope steeper and easier to climb. "Flame the mound. We are low on promethium. Then use demolition charges. Our own firing slit is beneath it. Then lose the slit." A detonation tore the corpse heap apart. Pieces of Tyranids rained across the wall. A severed claw struck a mortal soldier through the cheek and tore half his face away. He fell screaming with teeth and jawbone hanging from a strip of flesh. Another defender tried to drag him back and was hit by a living projectile that burrowed through his neck. The man's scream became a choking gargle as something moved visibly beneath the skin of his throat. Then the swarm reached the parapet. The war changed. Bolters became clubs between shots. Chainswords screamed to life. Mordath drew his own blade as the first creature vaulted the wall toward him. He stepped aside and cut through its middle. The teeth of the chain blade caught carapace, shrieked, then bit through. Alien blood sprayed his breastplate in a steaming fan. A second organism lunged low. Mordath put a bolt through its open mouth, and the rear of its skull burst across the stone. Around him, the battlement became butchery. A death shadow seized a smaller creature by the throat and crushed its neck in one gauntlet before another clawed across his pauldron. He turned, buried his chainsword through the attacker's chest, and ripped upward until the creature opened from sternum to jaw. Organs slapped across his armor. Acidic blood smoked where it touched exposed metal. Mortal troops fared worse. 3 gaunts struck one man at once. The first tore his rifle away. The second opened his abdomen. The third dragged him backward, while his intestines spilled over the parapet in wet coils. He screamed for help, until a claw punched through his face from beneath the chin and emerged from the top of his skull. Another soldier disappeared beneath a mass of bodies. Mordath saw one hand reach upward through the swarm, fingers opening and closing, before something tore the arm from its socket, and the hand vanished. A death shadow named Cordain lost his left arm at the shoulder to the scything blow of a larger organism. The severed limb fell still, gripping its bolter. Cordain did not fall. He rammed his remaining shoulder into the creature, drove it backward, and fired his bolt pistol into its abdomen until the magazine clicked empty. Lesser organisms climbed onto him. One hooked claws beneath his gorget. Another tore at the joint behind his knee. "Cordain!" Dravor roared. Cordain answered by headbutting one creature hard enough to split its skull. Then they pulled him down. His armor held for seconds. The joints did not. One organism tore the seal beneath his armpit. Another forced hooked claws into the gap at his hip. A third seized the exposed flesh where his arm had been. Cordain roared as they pulled in opposite directions. Muscle tore. The remains of his shoulder opened. Blood sprayed across black chitin. His lower body twisted until the spine gave way with a crack, audible even through gunfire. Still, he tried to rise. Then something bit into his throat. The roar stopped. 13 minutes after first contact, Mordath gave the order he had never expected to issue upon Sybari. "Yield the outer wall." Silence answered him for half a heartbeat. Dravor turned. "Repeat." "You heard me. We can hold. We can die here." Dravor looked over the parapet at the endless swarm. Mordath opened the command net to every surviving death shadow in the sector. "This is not retreat. Outer positions have served their purpose. Fall to the secondary kill zone. Weapons teams first. Mortal units cover withdrawal. Demolition crews prepare all access corridors for collapse." A mortal officer stared at him. "My lord, the auxiliaries will cover the withdrawal." The officer understood. He went pale. Mordath did not care. The death shadows withdrew with discipline, firing as they moved. Mortal troops remained behind because they had been ordered to remain behind. Some obeyed, some broke. Overseers shot several before the Tyranids reached them. Their deaths bought seconds. Seconds were now precious. The secondary defense line lay deeper within Karadval, where narrower avenues could funnel attackers between overlapping heavy weapons. Mordath reached it and turned to watch the outer wall disappear beneath the swarm. The dead moved. For one instant, even he misunderstood what he saw. Mountains of Tyranid corpses shifted along the parapets. Limbs jerked. Carapaces rolled. Split bodies slid down one another. Not resurrection. Something beneath them was climbing. Fresh organisms forced their way through the piles, tunneling beneath dead broods, pushing carcasses aside with clawed limbs. Others emerged from holes in the ground behind the corpse banks, where burrowing creatures had breached from below. The bodies of those the death shadows had killed were no longer obstacles. They had become cover, ramps, tunnels, terrain. Dravor stared at the moving mountains. "We killed all of those." Mordath watched fresh shapes crawl from beneath them. "Yes." Another mound began to writhe, then another. Across the entire lost wall, the dead rose only because the living beneath them had found use for their weight. Mordath tightened his grip upon his blade. For the first time in centuries of war, the number of enemies he had killed no longer felt like a measure of victory. It felt like construction. 19 minutes after the first confirmed ground assault, Warpsmith Karvek still believed the fortress could be made obedient. Karadval had been built to endure orbital bombardment, siege, sabotage, mutiny, and the corrosive passage of centuries. Its foundations plunged through volcanic bedrock in layered strata of ferrocrete, adamantium ribbing, and sealed industrial vaults. Geothermal conduits descended into the planet's wounded crust. Munition elevators moved through shafts deep enough to swallow hab-block towers. Maintenance arteries linked armories, generatoriums, fuel reservoirs, and subterranean transit lines beneath walls so thick that even heavy artillery would have required prolonged bombardment to penetrate them. Karvek knew every artery. He had rebuilt some with his own hands. Others he had altered until the plans preserved in the fortress archives bore little resemblance to what existed beneath the stone. He trusted those layers more than he trusted warriors, prophets, or gods. Flesh failed. Metal remembered. That certainty remained with him while the first warning rune appeared on the industrial auspex. Sublevel 34. Pressure loss. He glanced at it, and continued directing servitors toward a sealed ammunition conveyor. "Bulkhead 34, Gate 7, he ordered. A mortal overseer bent over his console. Sealing. Hydraulic locks engaged somewhere far below. The rune changed from amber to red. Pressure loss continued. Karvek's augmetic eye narrowed. Secondary gate. Closing. Another warning appeared. Sub-level 32, then 31, then 35. The overseer stared at the displays. Multiple ruptures. No. My lord. Impossible geometry. The breaches were not moving along corridors. They were appearing beneath them. Karvek linked directly into the fortress auger web. Data struck his mind in ordered streams. Vibration, heat, pressure, structural strain, coolant flow, airflow. The pattern emerged in fragments. Something was moving through stone beneath the fortress. Not mining, not drilling, digging, fast. He saw the next breach half a second before the alarm sounded. Sub-level 29. A maintenance tunnel camera flickered to life. For several moments the feed showed only dust. Then the wall moved, not shattered, moved. Ferrocrete bulged inward. Hairline cracks raced across its surface. Something struck from the other side. Once, twice. On the third impact, the wall burst. A massive claw emerged through the rubble, jointed and slick with black soil. It tore sideways, widening the opening. Another limb followed. Then a head with a blunt armored crest forced itself through, jaws opening beneath plates wet with subterranean filth. The maintenance crew died before they understood what they were seeing. One worker turned to run. A smaller organism shot through the breach beneath the larger beast and hit him between the shoulder blades. Claws punched through his chest. His sternum split outward. Blood struck the camera lens. The feed vanished. Karvek severed the connection. Seal the entire level. The overseer looked at him. There are 4,000 workers below the gate. They are now insulation. My lord, the ammunition crews. Seal it. Heavy doors descended through sub-level 29. Men ran beneath them. Some made it. Most did not. The bulkhead reached the floor upon bodies and crushed them into the threshold. Arms protruded beneath the seal. One hand continued opening and closing for several seconds. Karvek watched the pressure readings stabilize. Then corrosive alarms sounded inside the door mechanism. He turned back to the data. Organic fluid was eating through the locking pistons. Curious, he muttered. The overseer looked at him as though he had gone mad. Karvek ignored him. Flesh had not merely reached the machine. Flesh had arrived with a method for digesting it. The alarms multiplied. Ventilation shaft 14 reported movement. Karvek opened its internal pict feed and saw tiny organisms scuttling through a duct no Astartes could have entered even without armor. They moved in swarms, bodies scarcely larger than human hands, claws clicking against metal. A maintenance servitor encountered them at a junction. The swarm covered its face in seconds. Mandibles chewed through ocular housings and cabling. The servitor continued walking, while the creatures burrowed into its skull casing. Another camera showed a worker trying to seal an access grill. A narrow organism forced its head through before the grill closed. The worker struck it with a wrench. It bit through his wrist. He screamed and tried to pull away. The creature twisted, taking the hand with it. Blood pumped across the duct wall. More shapes pressed behind the first. Karvek shut down the camera. Flood ventilation sectors 6 through 12 with promethium vapor. The overseer paled. There are maintenance gangs inside. There are creatures inside. That concentration will ignite if... I am aware. The promethium pumps engaged. Seconds later, Karvek triggered the ignition. A deep concussion rolled through the floor. Several thousand workers died with the organisms hunting them. The warning runes did not stop. They simply moved. Karvek's arrogance persisted because arrogance to him was not emotion. It was accumulated evidence. He had defeated Imperial siege engineers. He had repaired vehicles beneath artillery fire. He had bound screaming warp entities into machines whose hulls had once carried the Aquila. He had watched mortals beg machinery for mercy before he introduced them to the devices that would replace their limbs. Nothing made of flesh could outlast a fortress if the fortress was used correctly. He opened a channel to Mordath. Subterranean penetration confirmed. The response came through heavy static. Extent: multiple industrial levels, burrowing organisms, smaller forms exploiting ventilation and service access. Containment: Karvek looked at 3 new breach runes. Temporary. How temporary? Do not waste my time with mortal questions. A pause. Then Mordath replied, I am sending veterans to you. I require corridors cleared before they arrive. You will have them. The first Death Shadow squad reached the transit nexus 7 minutes later. They came through smoke beneath red lumen strips, armor scorched from surface fighting, weapons already bloodied. Combi bolters rested in gauntlets. Chain axes hung from maglocks. One warrior carried a melter gun, whose muzzle glowed faintly from recent discharge. Another flexed the articulated fingers of a power fist, large enough to crush a mortal torso in one grip. Karvek met them beside a blast door that shook beneath repeated impacts from the other side. Positions. The warriors spread without question. Mortal auxiliaries crouched behind barricades farther back. Their laser guns trembled in their hands. The door bent inward. Once, twice. The central locking bar tore free. Now, Karvek said. The blast door burst open. The corridor vanished beneath bodies. The first Tyranid organism crossed the threshold and took a melter blast through the chest. Its torso became incandescent slurry. Behind it, lesser creatures rushed. Through the steam. Combi bolters opened. The enclosed space magnified every detonation until the corridor became a continuous hammering roar. Bolt shells struck chitin at distances measured in paces. Heads disappeared. Limbs spun away. Bodies slammed backward into those advancing behind. A Death Shadow stepped forward with a chain axe and hacked through one creature's neck. The rotating teeth tore through armor plate, muscle and vertebrae in a spray of dark blood. Another beast leapt at him. He caught it with his free hand, crushed its throat against the wall, and fired his bolter into its abdomen until the body burst open across his gauntlet. Karvek fired from behind them. His weapon was built into one of his mechadendrites. Short, brutal bursts stitched through smaller organisms. Another mechanical limb ended in a cutting torch that burned white-hot through a creature trying to climb the ceiling above him. The Tyranids kept coming. Armor held at first. Claws scraped across ceramite and snapped. Mandibles shattered against reinforced plates. Lesser organisms died in piles around the Astartes. Then the attacks concentrated. One Death Shadow was struck at the knee by 3 creatures at once. A claw found the flexible armor seal behind the joint. It punched through. The warrior stumbled. A second organism seized his arm. A third bit into the exposed cabling beneath his backpack. He roared and smashed one aside with his elbow, but the first creature wrenched its claw upward. The knee joint opened. Blood poured down the greave. The warrior dropped. The swarm covered him. His armor remained visible beneath them for several seconds, black plate jerking as he fought. Then a gaunt forced its jaws beneath the gorget. Another creature pulled his helm backward. Something tore. A length of spinal tissue came free with the helmet. The warrior stopped moving. Karvek watched for half a second. Then he fired through the corpse and killed the creatures feeding upon it. Advance. The veterans moved forward. The corridor became a grinder. Flamers washed intersections clean. Melterguns reduced larger organisms to collapsing masses of bubbling tissue. Power fists struck with enough force to pulp entire torsos against walls. Chain axes clogged with flesh and were cleared by revving them against stone. The Death Shadows took casualties. The Tyranids took hundreds. For several minutes, the tunnels belonged to chaos. Mordath made use of it. He ordered 2 veteran squads down parallel transit arteries beneath the eastern industrial quarter. The corridors had once carried ore trains and were broad enough for armored transports. Tyranid organisms were already flooding through both. The trap was simple. One squad advanced from the west, the other from the east. Heavy weapons sealed the adjoining junctions. Karvek controlled the doors. He waited until the swarm filled the central section. Then he closed everything. The first autocannon burst struck from one end. A second answered from the other. The trapped organisms had nowhere to go. Bolters and heavy weapons tore them apart in overlapping fire. Flames rolled through the enclosed transit line. Bodies piled against sealed doors. Larger creatures tried to force passages open and were struck by melter fire at point-blank range. For 4 minutes, the slaughter was absolute. Death Shadow's Vox traffic filled with kill confirmations. One squad reported no losses. Another requested more ammunition, not reinforcement. Karvek watched the Auspex display and felt something close to satisfaction. "There," he said to the mortal operator beside him. "Observe the difference between flesh and architecture." The operator nodded too quickly. "Machines define where war may occur." A new rune appeared beneath the heavy weapon squad. Karvek frowned. The floor temperature rose. He opened the local pict feed. The Death Shadows were reloading. The ground beneath them split. A claw larger than a mortal man erupted through the ferrocrete. The first havoc vanished to the waist. The floor exploded upward. Burrowing organisms came through beneath the firing line. The heavy weapons turned too slowly. A warrior tried to bring his autocannon down and was impaled through the abdomen. The claw emerged from his back, carrying loops of intestine and broken armor fragments. Another creature struck the ammunition loaders. The corridor detonated. Karvek's display went white. When it returned, the trapped Tyranid swarm no longer mattered. The hive mind had refused the corridor. It had gone beneath it. Mordath's voice came through immediately. "Status." They changed approach. They learned. Karvek stared at the new breach pattern. "Yes." The word tasted unpleasant. A second alarm sounded, then a third. Not troop corridors, magazine vaults. Karvek opened the ammunition district feed. Tyranids were inside. The creatures had not attacked the nearest defenders. They had gone around them, toward the munitions. "Seal magazine 12. No response. 13. Mechanism failure. 14. Corrosive damage." Karvek turned. "Detonate 12. The mortal officer stared at him. "My lord?" "Detonate it. There are 3 adjacent magazines." "I am aware." "And armories above." "I am aware." The officer hesitated. Karvek's mechadendrites snapped forward, wrapped around the man's throat, and lifted him from the floor. "Your purpose is obedience." The officer kicked once, then stopped. Karvek dropped the body and entered the command himself. Magazine 12 detonated. The explosion began beneath the fortress and became an earthquake. A column of fire tore upward through 3 industrial levels. Ammunition cooked off in cascading secondary blasts. Bolt shells detonated by the thousand. Missile racks erupted. Ferrocrete floors collapsed into one another. An entire section of Karad Val lifted, broke, and fell inward. On the surface, a fortress tower split down the middle. Inside the tunnels, thousands of Tyranid organisms vanished beneath flame and pulverized stone. Vox channels erupted in savage cheering. Death Shadows shouted praise to the dark gods. Mortal soldiers screamed that the tunnels had been cleared. Karvek said nothing. His Auspex redrew the fortress. The explosion had created a crater through 5 subterranean levels. The new opening connected 3 previously isolated tunnel networks directly to the industrial quarter. Red contact runes began moving through it. Karvek stared. The fortress had not destroyed the invasion route. It had widened it. He turned from the display. "Release the armor." The command moved through Karad Val. Engine vaults opened. Predators rolled first, tracks grinding over corpses and broken masonry. Their turrets rotated beneath smoke-blackened ceilings. Rhinos followed, carrying Death Shadow squads toward threatened courtyards. Behind them came heavier, corrupted machines, whose engines snarled with sounds no machine should have possessed. One courtyard outside the industrial halls had become completely filled with Tyranids. Karvek watched through a vehicle feed. Fire! Autocannons opened. The effect was enormous. Shells walked through the packed swarm in lines of explosions. Creatures burst apart so quickly that bodies became mist. Heavy bolters chopped through lesser organisms by the score. Lascannons punched holes through larger bioforms and continued into those behind. Demon-tainted engines charged into the mass, tracks crushing bodies until alien blood coated their armor. A predator advanced through a mound of corpses. Its guns fired without pause. A burning Tyranid crawled beneath its tracks and was flattened into black paste. Another creature leapt onto the hull. The pintle weapon cut it in half. For a brief moment, the courtyard looked like victory. Then larger organisms entered. One took an autocannon burst across the chest and continued forward. A second was struck by a Lascannon. Half its shoulder vanished. It did not stop.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
Smaller creatures swarmed around the tanks. They climbed vision ports, covered targeting lenses, jammed themselves beneath track housings. One predator tried to turn and could not. Its left track had become packed with bodies. The tank fired blindly. Tyranids climbed the turret. More piled on. Soon the vehicle disappeared beneath them. Only the barrel remained visible. Then that vanished too. Something ruptured a fuel line. Fire bloomed inside the heap. The predator's ammunition cooked off. The explosion lifted the entire mound and threw burning organisms across the courtyard. Karvek watched one land against the camera housing. It was missing both rear limbs. It still clawed forward. The feed cut. Then the fortress spoke, not through a mortal operator, through its own warning system. A deep mechanical voice echoed across the industrial levels. Breach confirmed. Subterranean level 1. Another voice followed. Breach confirmed. Subterranean level 2. Then another. Subterranean level 3. The sequence continued. 4, 5, 6, 7. The warnings overlapped. Karvek stared at the fortress schematic. Red filled level after level. Maintenance tunnels, armories, generatoriums, transit lines, fuel vaults, crew quarters, ventilation shafts, foundations. No pattern remained, no defensive geometry, no rear area. The voice continued counting breaches deeper into Karad Val. Karvek's mechadendrites slowly lowered. For the first time since the invasion began, he stopped thinking about doors. There were no doors left that mattered. He looked upon the red fortress schematic and understood what Mordath had already learned above. There was no longer a front line. 27 minutes after the first confirmed ground assault, the skies above Karad Val ceased to resemble atmosphere. They had become depthless layers of movement. Spores drifted through the smoke in yellow-grey curtains, each cloud thick enough to obscure whole fortress towers. Burning fragments of orbital organisms fell trailing black vapor. Winged creatures crossed between the descending debris in swarms so dense that the fortress augurs repeatedly mistook them for weather systems. Larger shapes moved among them, beating immense membranous wings against air already fouled by ash, promethium smoke, and the pulverized remains of everything that had died below. Lightning crawled through the clouds where weapons fire and atmospheric charge met. The sun had vanished entirely. Only the reflected glare of burning fortifications gave Sybari a horizon. Beneath that living storm, the primary aircraft vaults of Karad Val opened. Armored shutters the thickness of hab-block walls withdrew into the fortress. Warning klaxons sounded across launch decks stained with oil, blood, and fragments of alien flesh carried in by crews retreating from the outer works. Engines awakened one after another. The noise rolled through the cavern like chained thunder. Death Shadow's pilots sealed themselves into cockpits beneath scratched armor glass, while serfs ripped fuel hoses free and servitors detached loading frames from missile racks. Aircraft, that had been prepared to carry the warband toward Ultramar were now being hurled into skies already owned by something else. Mordath stood upon the command gallery, overlooking the launch deck. Night Reaver waited at the head of the formation. The Storm Eagle's black hull reflected the emergency lumens in strips of dull crimson. Its forward armor bore fresh scoring from debris that had struck the hangar mouth. Brass-edged markings ran along its wings. Missiles rested beneath hardened mounts. Cannon barrels tracked as machine spirits awakened beneath the hands of corrupted artificers. The craft looked predatory, even while stationary, a weapon built to descend upon worlds that had already lost hope. Its pilot's voice came through Mordath's vox. "Lord Captain, report. Night Reaver ready? Your corridor? Unclear. That is why you are going." There was a pause. Then the pilot answered with the calm of one who had expected nothing else. "Understood." Mordath looked toward the tactical projection suspended above the gallery. 3 fortress complexes remained in partial contact with Caradval. 2 had lost surface access. 1 had reported its command bunker isolated beneath repeated airborne strikes. Between them stretched 100 kilometers of broken fortifications, ash wastes, and Tyranid infestation. Ground reinforcement was already impossible. The sky route was worse. It was also the only route left. "Primary objective is passage," Mordath said. "Open an airborne corridor between Caradval and Val Orden. Secondary objective is suppression of flying organisms over the eastern extraction grounds. Do not pursue beyond weapons range. Do not waste missiles on single targets. Kill concentrations. Preserve altitude where possible." The pilot replied, "And if altitude belongs to them? Take it back." Night Reaver launched first. Its engines struck the hangar with such force that loose equipment skittered across the deck. The Storm Eagle accelerated along the launch channel, crossed the armored threshold, and vanished into yellow smoke. Other aircraft followed in staggered pairs. For several seconds, Mordath saw only engine flare and black silhouettes. Then the sky swallowed them. The first contact came almost immediately. Night Reaver climbed through a bank of spores and emerged beneath a cluster of winged organisms moving toward the fortress. Its pilot did not hesitate. Missile locks flared. A salvo launched beneath both wings. The explosions tore open the swarm. Creatures vanished in expanding spheres of flame. Burning wings folded. Bodies spun downward, trailing ichor. Night Reaver passed directly through the remains, forward guns hammering another group apart before they could change direction. 2 attack craft followed behind it. Their pilots flew close enough to overlap fields of fire without interfering with one another's maneuvers. Cannon bursts stitched through clusters of airborne organisms. Missiles were reserved for the larger shapes. One pilot climbed sharply above a descending brood, rolled inverted, and fired into the exposed underside of the largest creature as he passed. The thing folded around the impacts and dropped through the formation beneath it. Death Shadow's pilots had hunted aircraft above Imperial worlds for centuries. They understood speed. They understood killing angles. They understood how fear altered a pilot's hands. The Tyranids offered them no fear to exploit, but for the first several passes, skill was enough. Night Reaver cut a path eastward. Mordath watched kill markers bloom across the tactical feed. "Corridor forming," a controller reported. "Do not call it formed until something survives passage." Another icon disappeared. "Aircraft 7 lost." "How?" "Impact." "With what?" "Unknown." The answer came seconds later. Night Reaver entered a cloud that had not existed when its previous auger sweep passed through the region. Spores struck the hull like sand against armor glass. Some burst on contact, releasing corrosive fluids that hissed across the plating. Others stuck. Tiny organisms unfolded from them and began crawling along the wing surfaces. The pilot increased speed. The creatures remained attached. Warning runes appeared across the cockpit. Port intake obstruction, optical sensor degradation, wing surface contamination. Then the atmosphere around the Storm Eagle filled with smaller living shapes. Not attack craft, not even obvious combat organisms. A cloud. They struck the hull by the hundreds. Some broke apart upon impact. Others wedged themselves into seams, vents, and control surfaces. The Night Reaver's forward-picked feed became a blur of wings, claws, blood, and pulverized flesh. The pilot fired retros and rolled. Half the organisms tore away. The rest remained. His voice came over the command channel, strained but controlled. Sky itself is infested. Mordath watched static crawl across the feed. Maintain vector. Already doing so. Below, the extraction grounds opened. Mordath had ordered the removal of only what mattered. Gene seed reserves were brought first, sealed within armored reliquaries carried by death shadows under heavy guard. Relic weapons followed. Ammunition crates were dragged from partially collapsed magazines. Data cores containing the operational intelligence gathered for the Ultramar campaign were removed from command vaults and loaded into hardened cases. Officers still capable of coordinating surviving sectors were ordered toward designated craft. No civilian evacuation order was issued. No slave columns were assigned transport priority. No mortal family was gathered. Sybari had never been built to save lives. It had been built to spend them. That distinction became clear the moment the extraction gates opened. Thousands of mortal soldiers and laborers had gathered outside. Some had abandoned posts. Others had fled lower levels after hearing that Tyranids were inside the foundations. Wounded men dragged themselves through the crowd. Servants clutched bundles of possessions they would never use again. Thralls stared toward the waiting aircraft with expressions that had forgotten discipline and remembered only escape. The gates opened. The crowd surged. "Hold them," Mordath ordered. Death shadows guarding the runway raised bolters. A mortal commander screamed for the crowd to stop. Nobody listened. The first bolt volley struck waist-high. Bodies burst open. Men in the front ranks disappeared in red explosions of flesh and shattered bone. Those behind tripped over them and were crushed beneath the pressure from the rear. Another volley ripped through the mass. A soldier lost both legs above the knees and fell screaming while men stamped across his torso. A slave carrying a child-sized ammunition satchel took a bolt through the chest and sprayed fragments of ribs across the armor of the Astartes who had shot him. The survivors stopped. For several heartbeats, fear of the death shadows overcame fear of the swarm. "Clear the runway," Mordath said. They obeyed. Then the ground beneath them opened. A long fracture split the extraction zone. Stone heaved upward. Tyranid organisms came through from below. The crowd ceased to be a crowd. It became meat under pressure. Men scattered in every direction. Some ran toward the aircraft, others toward the fortress gates. Smaller creatures burst from the fissure and hit them from behind, claws opening backs, jaws tearing through thighs and abdomens. One soldier fell beneath 3 organisms and vanished except for one boot kicking against the stone. Another was lifted by a larger beast and bitten through the torso. The upper half struck the runway several paces from the lower. Then the airborne swarm descended. Winged organisms dropped through the smoke onto the same killing ground. A death shadow fired upward until something struck him from behind. Another warrior tore a creature off his pauldron and crushed its skull in one gauntlet, then fired into the crowd because mortals were blocking the line of fire. The extraction zone became a bowl of blood. Night Reaver arrived above it at full speed. Its weapons opened before the pilot finished the turn. Cannon fire scythed through the descending swarm. Missiles detonated above the runway and shredded clusters of winged organisms into burning rain. The Storm Eagle banked so low that its wingtip nearly struck a fortress tower, then climbed through its own fire and came around again. "Runway corridor open," the pilot said. "Again," Mordath ordered. Night Reaver returned. A larger flying organism crossed its path. The pilot fired. The creature's chest burst. Its corpse struck the Storm Eagle's starboard wing. The impact shook the entire craft. Warning tones screamed in the cockpit. Something wet and fibrous wrapped around one control surface. The pilot forced the aircraft level. Another pass. More organisms died. Another impact. A section of armor tore from the underside. The Night Reaver's machine spirit flooded its pilot with damage reports. Hydraulic pressure falling. Intake contamination increasing. Starboard control response degrading. Forward sensor cluster partially blinded. "Withdraw," Mordath ordered. The pilot said nothing. "Night Reaver, withdraw. I have one pass. You have damage. I have ammunition." Mordath almost countermanded him. Then he saw the eastern runway. The gene seed reliquaries had not yet reached the waiting transport. A mass of winged organisms was descending directly toward them. "Make it count." Night Reaver turned. The Storm Eagle came through the smoke like a black spear. Its remaining missiles launched in pairs. One cluster of Tyranids vanished, then another. Forward cannon fire tore a channel through the swarm. The pilot held the attack longer than was safe, keeping the nose down while warning runes multiplied across his display. The gene seed convoy reached the aircraft below. For one instant, the path was clear. Then something enormous descended from above the Storm Eagle. The pilot never saw the whole creature. His sensors were too damaged and the sky too crowded. One moment there was cloud. The next, claws filled the upper picked feed. The Tyranid struck Night Reaver across the spine. Armor folded. The Storm Eagle dropped several meters in an instant. The pilot fired upward, but the weapon angle was wrong. The creature hit again. One wing cracked near the root. The aircraft rolled. The pilot fought the controls. "Night Reaver." No answer. The Storm Eagle fell through the living storm. Its damaged engine ignited. Black smoke poured behind it. The enormous Tyranid remained attached for several seconds, claws buried through armor and structural members. Then the failing. Aircraft clipped a fortress spire. The impact tore the creature away. It also tore off most of the starboard wing. Night Reaver began to spin. Mordath watched through the extraction ground picked feed as the Storm Eagle crossed the skyline sideways. One engine burning, nose dropping, fragments of armor scattering behind it. It struck a defense tower. The world became fire. The lower half of the tower vanished in the explosion. Stone, adamantium, and aircraft fragments blasted outward. The upper structure collapsed through the fireball and broke apart. Burning wreckage rained across the extraction zone. A section of wing the size of a tank landed among the Tyranids and crushed a dozen organisms beneath it. Another fragment cut through a group of fleeing mortals like a blade, reducing bodies to pieces. The blast cleared the sky. For 3 seconds, nothing flew above Karad Val. Mordath looked upward. He saw open cloud, smoke, fire. Then movement entered the gap. Winged organisms descended through it. Hundreds, then thousands. The whole Night Reaver had burned into the swarm, closed as though it had never existed. Mordath said nothing for several heartbeats. A flight controller spoke first. Remaining aircraft awaiting vector. He looked at the tactical display. The aerial corridor was gone. Val Orden had disappeared from the Voxnet. 2 attack craft were trapped beyond the eastern ridge. Another had engine contamination severe enough that its pilot was attempting an emergency landing inside a courtyard, already reporting subterranean breaches. The sky was no longer contested. It had become habitat. Mordath opened all aviation channels. "Surviving aircraft return immediately." One pilot answered, "Lord, we can continue suppression." "No, we still possess weapons." So did Night Reaver. Silence. Mordath watched another wave of biological contacts fill the airspace. All surviving aircraft abandon the sky. Land at the nearest controlled fortress. If landing is impossible, crash within friendly walls. Preserve crews where possible. Destroy craft before capture if not. A pilot gave a bitter laugh through the Vox. "Capture?" Mordath looked at the Tyranid mass. "No," he said. "There will be no capture." The surviving aircraft descended. One by one, their icons vanished beneath fortress roofs or static. Karad Val's armored hangar shutters began to close. Outside them, the Tyranids filled the air. Mordath watched until the last sliver of poisoned sky disappeared behind the descending gates. Sybari's fortresses had lost the roads beneath them. Now they had lost the heavens above. Each stronghold stood alone beneath a living atmosphere, separated from every other by swarms in the earth, swarms upon the ground, and swarms in the sky. The death shadows had come to Sybari years before, believing the fortress world was a hidden blade poised against Ultramar. Now the blade had become a chain of islands, and the ocean around them was alive. 34 minutes after the first confirmed ground assault, Sorcerer Lord Malefor was chained beneath the fortress he had once ruled. The warded chamber lay behind 3 adamantium doors in the lowest surviving sanctum of Caradval, far from the shattered strategium and farther still from the walls where the death shadows were dying. It had been built centuries before for the containment of summoned things that proved too dangerous to release and too valuable to destroy. Now, its iron restraints held the warband's master. Chains engraved with profane sigils bound Malefor's wrists, throat and ankles to a black stone throne. Hexagrammatic circles had been carved into the floor and filled with coagulated blood. Braziers burned with oils that produced no ordinary flame. The walls were lined with the skulls of psykers whose souls had once been used to strengthen the chamber's wards. None of it had been designed for him. None of it was enough. Malefor pulled against the chains until the metal groaned. He no longer knew whether he was beneath the fortress. He no longer knew whether there was a fortress. The shadow had become everything. He could feel the organisms moving through Sybari above him, not as separate creatures, but as impulses upon an immeasurable body. Claws entering stone became pressure against his teeth. Wings beating through the poisoned atmosphere became vibrations behind his eyes. Feeding, organisms opening their jaws caused his stomach to contract. When a Tyranid died beneath bolter fire, Malefor perceived not death, but interruption, one signal extinguished among numbers so immense that the loss possessed no meaning. He tried to invoke the powers he had served. He called inwardly to the warp. For centuries, something had always answered, sometimes with whispers, sometimes with visions, sometimes with pain, sometimes with gifts that required payment in flesh, sanity, or the souls of those weaker than himself. Chaos had never been silent. That had been part of its seduction. The powers beyond reality might lie, but lies acknowledged the listener. Demons mocked because they recognized pride. Gods tempted because desire existed. Rage, lust, ambition, despair, hatred, obsession, fear. Every weakness could become a door, and every door opened onto something waiting to enter. Malefor understood such things. He had built his existence upon them. He had bargained. He had threatened. He had murdered rivals whose patrons whispered louder than his own. He had sacrificed cities because screams carried farther in the immaterium than prayers. He had believed himself wise because he understood that the universe was ruled not by justice, but appetite. Now he had discovered an appetite that did not bargain. There was no voice behind the shadow, no promise, no temptation, no hatred, no delight, no malice he could seize and turn, only consumption. The distinction was destroying him. "You are not empty," Malefor whispered. The chamber guards exchanged glances. There were 6 death shadows within the sanctum, all chosen from warriors whose loyalty to Malefor had once been unquestioned. Their armor bore fresh wounds. One had lost the lower half of his helm and most of the flesh beneath it. Another carried a bolter with an ammunition counter flickering near depletion. They had been ordered by Mordath to keep Malefor contained. The Sorcerer Lord laughed. "You pretend emptiness." One of the guards tightened his grip upon his weapon. Malefor turned his head toward a corner where nothing stood. "I know hunger. You are not hunger." He waited. Nothing answered. His smile collapsed. "You are beneath them." Again, silence. "The gods sent you." The shadow pressed harder. Malefor's face twisted. No. His chains rattled. No. No, you are a sign. He began to laugh again, but this time the sound broke halfway through. One of the death shadows stepped toward him. My lord. Malefor looked through him. Do you hear them? The warrior said nothing. The gods. The death shadow lowered his head. Malefor leaned forward as far as the chains allowed. Do you hear them? No. The answer seemed to wound him. For a long moment, only the distant concussion of battle disturbed the chamber. Then another door opened. Lieutenant Vargul entered with 4 warriors behind him. The guards raised bolters. You are forbidden entry, the senior guard said. Vargul's armor was scorched almost white across one pauldron. Strips of parchment covered in dark prayers hung from chains about his breastplate. Blood, both human and alien, had dried across his gauntlets. Forbidden by whom? Lord Captain Mordath. Vargul spat onto the floor. Mordath commands guns. He does not command faith. He commands Sybari. Sybari is dying. That does not change the order. It changes everything. The guards shifted. Vargul looked toward Malefor. The Sorcerer Lord was staring at him now. Recognition flickered across his face. Vargul. The lieutenant bowed. My lord. Release me. The senior guard moved between them. No. Vargul looked at him. You would keep our greatest weapon chained while beasts eat our walls? Our greatest weapon killed our own warriors. Our greatest weapon has spoken with powers that would turn armies to ash. He no longer knows which army is which. Vargul stepped closer. Then perhaps the gods will remind him. The guard raised his bolter. Vargul moved first. His blade entered beneath the warrior's gorget and punched through the soft armor seal. He twisted. Blood poured down the front of the breastplate. The guard fired once into the ceiling before Vargul tore the blade free and kicked him backward. The chamber erupted. Bolter, fire hammered against warded stone. One of Vargul's warriors took a round through the shoulder and spun into the wall. Another guard lost half his head when a bolt shell entered through the exposed side of his helm and detonated inside the skull. Bone and brain matter struck the iron restraints behind Malefor. The fight lasted seconds. When it ended, 4 guards were dead. One remained kneeling with a bolt pistol pressed to his own shattered abdomen. Vargul approached him. You choose chains while Sybari burns. The wounded warrior laughed blood through his teeth. I choose not to trust a madman. Vargul shot him through the mouth. Then he turned toward the throne. Release him. The surviving death shadows broke the seals. One chain fell, then another. The final restraint opened. Malefor rose. For one heartbeat, everyone in the chamber believed they had done the right thing. The Sorcerer Lord stood straighter than he had in the Strategium. His eyes burned violet again. Psychic fire crawled along his armor, but this time it obeyed him. He looked toward the ceiling as though he could see through kilometers of stone. Take me to the walls, Vargul bowed. As the gods command. Malefor smiled faintly. No. His gaze remained fixed upward. As I command. They emerged into hell. The upper battlements of Karadval had become a landscape of corpses. Tyranid bodies covered the approaches in mounds high enough to obscure sections of the outer fortifications. Fires burned within the heaps where Promethium had soaked into flesh. Mortal dead lay among them, sometimes whole, more often in pieces. The air tasted of propellant, acid, and cooked meat. Every surviving gun position was firing. Mordath saw Malefor the moment he emerged from the stairwell. His reaction was immediate. Who released him? Vargul stepped forward. I did. Mordath's bolt pistol came up. Malefor raised one hand. Not yet. Something in his voice stopped them all, even Mordath. The Sorcerer Lord walked to the broken parapet. The Tyranid swarm stretched beyond sight. He lifted both hands. The warp answered. For the first time since Behemoth entered the system, it answered cleanly. Violet light erupted across the battlements. A brood of charging organisms burst apart simultaneously. Their bodies opened from within, chitin splitting as blood and organs were thrown across the ground. Another group rose into the air as though seized by an invisible fist, limbs thrashing before Malifaux smashed them against the fortress wall, hard enough to reduce them to pulp. He laughed. Power gathered around him. A larger beast pushed through the corpses below. Malifaux pointed. Purple fire struck it. The creature burned without ordinary flame. Carapace blackened, flesh contracted. Its skull split, and a column of incandescent matter erupted from the wound. Death shadows shouted from the battlements. Vargul raised his weapon. "The gods answer!" Malifaux extended his arms. The ground beyond the wall convulsed. Dozens of Tyranids were hurled aside. Others imploded. One creature simply came apart into ribbons of flesh as invisible force twisted its body in opposing directions. Winged organisms crossing overhead, ignited and fell, trailing psychic fire. A massive bioform reaching the wall had its head wrenched backward until the neck tore open and the skull came free in a fountain of dark blood. For several breaths, the assault stopped. Not everywhere, but here, at Caradval. The impossible swarm recoiled beneath the fury of one mind. Even Mordath felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Then Malifaux sensed the thing watching through the swarm. Not eyes, never eyes, attention. Somewhere beyond the walls, a larger organism raised its head. Its skull was swollen beneath layers of pale chitin. Smaller creatures clustered around it, but did not protect it in the manner of soldiers protecting a commander. They moved as organs about a heart. Malifaux felt the shadow gather. The warp vanished beneath him. He screamed. Every lumen along the battlement exploded. The psychic fire surrounding his body turned white. The world ceased to possess edges. He was inside the swarm again. Claw, wing, blood, heat, hunger, movement. Millions of sensory impressions passed through him at once. He tried to hold his name. Malifaux. A gaunt died. Malifaux. A winged creature. Descended. Malifaux. A feeding mouth opened. Malifaux. Something burrowed through stone. The name dissolved. He no longer knew whether the hands raised before him belonged to an Astartes sorcerer or to one of the countless limbs striking against Sybari. He saw Mordath. Enemy. No. Brother. No. Resistance. Food. No. The distinction collapsed. Malifaux struck. Psychic force hit the Death Shadow's line. 3 warriors were thrown from the battlement. One struck a gun emplacement head first and folded over it, his spine breaking beneath the armor. Another was hurled through a crenellation and vanished into the swarm below. Vargul stared at Malifaux. "My lord?" Malifaux turned. Violet flame poured from his eyes. Vargul raised both hands. "The gods are with you." Malifaux burned him. The lieutenant's armor glowed red. He screamed as the flesh inside it cooked. His eye lenses melted into the sockets beneath. Smoke poured from his gorget. When he fell, the impact cracked open his breastplate and released the smell of roasted meat. The remaining Death Shadows backed away. Malifaux laughed, then wept, then screamed words in a language none of them understood. A warrior fired. The bolt struck Malifaux's pauldron and detonated. The sorcerer spun. His face became fury. "You dare!" Another warrior fired. Then another. Bolter shells hammered into Malifaux's armor. He raised one hand and crushed the nearest shooter where he stood. Ceramite buckled inward. The warrior's abdomen ruptured beneath the pressure, blood and intestine forcing through broken armor seals. Mordath fired. His bolt struck Malifaux in the chest. The sorcerer staggered. For one instant, recognition returned. "There!" Mordath fired again. Malifaux lifted a hand, perhaps to attack, perhaps to defend. The shadow descended upon him. His psychic senses opened one final time. There were no gods. There were no brothers. There was no Sybari. Only the terrible weight of countless lives, without individuality, and an intelligence too vast to care that Malifaux had ever existed. The Sorcerer Lord screamed. Something within him broke. Violet fire erupted through the seams of his armor. His body arched. The energy burst outward. Stone shattered. Death shadows were hurled to the ground. Malifaux's flesh split beneath his armor as power tore through him from within. Blood boiled from his mouth. One eye burst. His gauntlets clawed at empty air, while the psychic fire consumed what remained of his body. Then Mordath's final bolt struck him through the face. Malifaux fell. The fire went out. No thunder rolled. No demon came to claim him. No voice spoke from the warp. His corpse struck the stones and remained there while the Tyranids resumed climbing the walls. Mordath looked down at him for less than a second. Then he turned. All surviving units acknowledge my authority. No ceremony followed. No warrior knelt. No title was bestowed. There was no time. Dravor answered first. Acknowledged. Karvek's voice arrived through static from below. Acknowledged. Other responses followed. Some came from fortress sectors Mordath had believed destroyed. Many never came at all. Planetary status, he ordered. A mortal operator stumbled toward the nearest surviving tactical station. Blood ran from a cut across his scalp. His hands shook as he summoned the planetary display. The hololith flickered. Sybari appeared. The operator stared. That is incorrect. Mordath looked at him. Explain. The synchronization rune. The assault clock must have desynchronized. Why? The man swallowed. Because these losses cannot have occurred in this interval. Show me. The tactical globe expanded. Fortress Dral was dark. Val Orden was dark. The western defense chain no longer transmitted. 3 surface bastions had vanished from the network entirely. The southern armory complex showed no friendly signals. An entire equatorial defense sector had gone silent within the last 8 minutes. Red infestation markers spread across continents. Not fronts, continents. The operator reset the clock. Nothing changed. He reset it again. Stop, Mordath said. My lord, the clock is correct. The man looked sick. Fortresses built to resist siege for days had disappeared in minutes. Defensive lines intended to withstand imperial armies had become feeding grounds before many reserve units had even reached their assigned positions. Mordath looked across the tactical globe. Caradval remained one of the largest surviving points of resistance. That no longer felt like strength. It felt like being the largest piece of meat left upon the table. Dravor stood beside him. How long? Mordath looked at the assault clock. Less than 40 minutes. He remembered Ultramar, the plans, the sabotage networks, the invasion routes, the populations they had intended to break. All of it belonged to another universe now. A roar rose beyond the walls. The swarm was coming again. Dravor checked his remaining ammunition. Can we hold? Mordath studied the red planet. The answer was obvious. He did not insult them by lying. No. Dravor was silent. Mordath closed the tactical display. We are no longer deciding whether Sybari stands. He drew his blade. Outside, something enormous struck the fortress wall. We are deciding where we die. 42 minutes after the first confirmed ground assault, Lord Captain Ver Mordath chose attack over extinction. The decision was not born of hope. Hope had become another resource Sybari no longer possessed. Ammunition could be counted. Armor could be measured by thickness. Surviving warriors could be marked upon a tactical display. Hope had no such value. It did not kill. It did not seal breaches. It did not restore Vox contact to fortresses that had gone silent beneath the swarm. Mordath had seen too many commanders mistake desperation for strategy, and too many warriors call suicide courage when they lacked the imagination to do anything else. He would not die that way. If Caradval was to become their tomb, then the death shadows would choose where the grave was dug and how many enemies were buried beneath them. The surviving strategium lay 3 levels below the ruined command sanctum, inside a hardened chamber once reserved for secondary siege control. Its hololithic projectors flickered beneath repeated power fluctuations. Half the consoles were dead. One entire wall had been cracked by subterranean impact. Blood coated the deck around the communications pits, and the corpse of a mortal signalman remained slumped over a terminal because nobody had time to move him. Mordath stood before the tactical projection. "Show me the pressure points." Karvek's image resolved through static above one functioning console. The warpsmith was still somewhere beneath the industrial levels, though whether he commanded a bunker, a machine vault, or merely a room not yet eaten was impossible to tell. Define pressure. Where the lesser creatures change behavior. The hololith shifted. Several concentrations appeared around Karadval. The Death Shadows still lacked names for most of what assaulted them. Names belonged to familiarity, and familiarity required survival. They had no archive entries explaining the vast living guns pulsing behind the front, or the crested beasts that seemed to bind smaller organisms into disciplined packs. They knew only function. "Here," Mordath said. He marked a cluster beyond the eastern plaza. A large organism moved there beneath pick distortion, its skull rising above the surrounding swarm beneath a crown of ridged chitin. Smaller creatures altered course whenever it advanced. The crown beast. Dravor stood beside him. 3 others within weapons range. 4. Where? Mordath magnified a ruined transit sector. There, beneath the artillery organisms. Dravor studied the feed. A squat shape pulsed behind shattered defense towers, while other creatures gathered around it. Farther back, vast gun beasts discharged living projectiles toward Karadval. "You call that a node? I call it worth killing." Karvek transmitted another image. Additional controlling organisms detected beneath the western drainage quarter. Picked quality poor. Mordath looked over the spread of targets. "Then we cut the nerves." Dravor gave a low growl. "With what remains?" "With everything." That answer pleased him. Not because it promised survival, because it was simple. The Death Shadows had been forged into saboteurs long before Sybari became their fortress. They had learned to cripple stronger foes by attacking what those foes assumed was safe. They had infiltrated void stations under stolen transponder codes, planted charges beneath imperial shrines while worshippers still prayed above them, poisoned water systems, collapsed transit lines, detonated fuel depots, and turned command bunkers into crematoria. They had always preferred the wound behind the armor. Now they would perform the same work upon their own world. Karadval contained passages that did not exist on any surviving plan. False walls concealed old Sally tunnels. Service shafts connected armories to forgotten maintenance chambers. Several transit routes had been constructed specifically so defenders could emerge behind a besieging force. Karvek had sealed some during earlier stages of the invasion. Others remained open because the Tyranids had not yet found them. Mordath would make them useful once, then they could collapse forever. Sabotage squads descended first. They moved through darkness without lumen strips, guided by helm displays and centuries of familiarity with close confines. Each warrior carried demolition charges in addition to his normal war gear. Mortal engineers followed where space permitted, burdened with detonators, cable spools, and explosive packs they barely understood. The Death Shadows did not explain the plan to them. Knowledge was not required. The first team reached the foundations beneath the eastern plaza. The ceiling shook continuously. Dust fell in curtains. Through the stone above came the dull vibration of thousands of claws. A Death Shadow placed one gauntlet against the wall. Massed directly overhead, his squad leader nodded. Set everything. Charges were fixed against support columns and buried beside structural seams. Additional explosives were wedged into an ancient transit conduit beneath the plaza's center. The mortals worked quickly because the Astartes standing behind them would kill anyone who did not. One engineer paused. The floor beneath his boots clicked. He looked down. A thin claw emerged through the stone and pierced his foot. The man screamed. The death shadow beside him fired a single bolt round into his head. The corpse collapsed. "Continue." The remaining engineers continued. Elsewhere, another sabotage team moved beneath the artillery positions. A third entered the western drainage works. A fourth never reached its objective. Its final transmission contained bolter fire, a shouted warning, and then nothing. Mordath accepted the loss. 4 teams had been useful. 3 would have to suffice. Dravor. The Havoc captain checked the ammunition feed of his autocannon. "Ready? Begin." The fortress opened fire. Not wildly, not in anger. The Death Shadows had learned what ammunition waste looked like, and now every shot was selected. Autocannons targeted dense broods approaching the eastern sector. Heavy shells struck in disciplined bursts, chopping corridors through the swarm and forcing fresh organisms into narrower avenues. Missile launchers fired frag warheads into concentrations of lesser creatures and crack payloads into larger forms. Lascannons ignored everything beneath monstrous size. Their beams punched through armored skulls, thoraxes, and weapon creatures with deliberate economy. Melter teams waited. They fired only when something large came close enough to deserve annihilation. One gun beast advanced from behind a collapsed tower, its swollen weapon organs pulsing beneath translucent membranes. A death shadow stepped from cover. The melter gun discharged. The creature's front half ceased to possess structure. Chitin and flesh became incandescent vapor. The remaining body collapsed forward, crushing 3 smaller organisms beneath it. "Target destroyed," the warrior reported. "Move." No celebration, no wasted second. Mordath led the spearhead from the eastern gate. The doors opened just far enough. The first Tyranids forced themselves toward the gap. They met bolter fire at point-blank range. Mordath's warriors advanced through the breach before the bodies finished falling. His blade struck first. The chain-edged weapon bit through the neck of a gaunt-like creature and tore the head free. Dark blood sprayed across his chest plate. A second organism lunged from the side. Mordath caught one claw on his vambrace, felt ceramite score beneath the impact, then drove his bolt pistol beneath the creature's jaw and fired. Its skull burst over his shoulder. The spearhead moved as one. Death shadows formed overlapping pairs, one warrior firing while the other advanced, then reversing roles without command. Centuries of shared war lived in those movements. They needed no shouted instructions. A larger beast charged. 3 bolters struck its head. The rounds detonated against chitin and failed to kill it. Dravor fired from behind the line. His autocannon burst tore through the creature's upper torso and threw it sideways. A death shadow stepped over the twitching body and buried a chain axe into its skull until the teeth reached brain matter. "Forward." The word came from Mordath. They obeyed. Every pace cost something. A warrior named Cole Vareth took a claw through the forearm. The limb remained attached, but the armor split and blood filled the gauntlet. He shifted his bolter to the other hand and continued. Another death shadow lost half his helm to a living projectile. The round entered beneath one eye lens and exited through the rear plate in a spray of brain tissue. He fell without sound. A third warrior killed 5 lesser organisms before a larger creature struck him in the chest. The blow cracked his breastplate and threw him into rubble. He rose. The second blow removed his head. Mordath did not stop. The spearhead reached the first marker. "The crown beast," Dravor said. It stood beyond a field of corpses. The organism was larger at close range than it had appeared through the picked feeds. Its skull rose in armored ridges. Its limbs were longer than an Astartes was tall. Around it moved broods that seemed almost disciplined compared with the frantic swarms elsewhere. Mordath raised his pistol. "Everything upon it." Lascannon fire crossed overhead. One beam struck the creature's shoulder and blew away a slab of carapace. It turned. A missile hit its flank. The explosion staggered it, but did not bring it down. Mordath charged. The creature met him. A bladed limb struck his left pauldron. Ceramite split. The force drove him sideways. Pain flashed through his shoulder. He came back beneath the second strike and drove his chain blade into the wound opened by the Lascanon. The weapon screamed. Teeth tore through flesh. The crown beast convulsed. It struck him again. Mordath lost his footing. A death shadow beside him stepped forward and fired a melter-gun into the creature's exposed side. The blast opened its torso. Internal organs collapsed into incandescent ruin. The crown beast fell. The effect around them was immediate. Nearby Tyranids faltered. Some stopped. Others turned unpredictably. One brood attacked another. Dravor's autocannon cut them down. "Node disrupted," he said. Mordath pulled his blade free. Second target. They moved. The death shadows did not merely kill. They guided. Autocannon fire drove broods away from one route and toward another. Bolter teams withdrew deliberately, offering apparent weakness. Lesser Tyranids surged through the openings, exactly where Mordath wanted them. The eastern plaza filled. Thousands of organisms crowded over the shattered ground. More followed, because the path ahead remained open. Mordath waited until the mass became dense enough. First charge. Far beneath them, explosives detonated. The plaza rose. Stone became fragments. The center of the battlefield disappeared inside an expanding column of flame, dust, and pulverized bodies. Tyranids were thrown into the air by the hundreds. Others vanished completely. The blast collapsed transit tunnels beneath the plaza, swallowing entire broods. Before the debris fell, the western charges fired, then the drainage works, then the secondary demolition line beneath the artillery quarter. Explosions raced through Karadval's outer districts like a chain of buried thunder. One building folded inward, another lifted from its foundations and came apart. A gun beast vanished beneath collapsing masonry. A cluster of controlling organisms disappeared with it. Thousands upon thousands of Tyranids died within seconds. The death shadows kept firing. Lascanon struck another command beast while it was exposed by the blasts. Bolters tore apart disordered lesser organisms. Mordath climbed onto broken stone and looked across the battlefield. The swarm had stopped. Not everywhere, but here. Across the eastern approaches, movement lost coherence. Creatures milled among the wreckage. Some retreated, others attacked aimlessly. A brood that had been climbing one wall fell apart into scattered packs. The silence was not complete, yet compared with the endless pressure before it, the change felt vast. Mordath checked the assault chronometer. 27 seconds. The death shadows had broken the attack. For 27 seconds. Dravor looked at him. "Again," Mordath almost answered. Then the swarm moved. Not the same way. Fresh organisms emerged from behind the ruined district. Larger creatures appeared among them. Different ones. Some carried cranial structures, unlike the beasts the death shadows had killed. Others moved deeper within the swarm, protected by layers of expendable bodies. The lesser broods changed with them. Disorder became direction. Direction became assault. 31 seconds after the last demolition charge detonated, the eastern Tyranids resumed advancing. Dravor stared. No. Mordath understood before he did. They replaced them. More organisms poured through the ruins. The broken node had become another node. The lost command beasts had become irrelevant. The swarm was not organized around individuals. It was organized around function. Destroy one creature, and another inherited the purpose. Destroy 10, and the purpose survived. Mordath looked at the dead around him. Kol Vareth had fallen near the second objective. 3 centuries of war lay face down in the dirt, with his remaining arm still wrapped around a bolter. Another warrior nearby had served since before Mordath remembered his name. Those deaths mattered to the death shadows. Every Astartes lost was gene seed lost, experience lost, memory lost, centuries of battle erased. To the swarm, no such concept existed. The Gaunts they had killed were not soldiers in the sense Mordath understood. They were expenditure, claws grown for a purpose, flesh shaped for a task, biomass given temporary form, and Behemoth possessed more of it than Sybari possessed ammunition. That was the true weapon, not the claws, not the living guns, not even the shadow. The weapon was indifference to loss. Mordath opened the command net. All spearhead units, withdraw to Caradval. Drevor turned. The route? Mordath looked back. The answer was already there. The path they had used to leave the fortress was gone. Not destroyed. Covered. Fresh Tyranids flooded over the rubble behind them in numbers so dense that the ground itself had disappeared. Smaller organisms climbed over larger ones. Winged shapes descended into the gaps. Burrowing creatures broke through the stone where the death shadows might otherwise have passed. Their counterattack had pushed too far. The hive mind had closed behind them. Drevor checked his autocannon. Then we cut back through. Mordath looked toward Caradval. The fortress stood beyond a moving carpet of claws, teeth, and armored flesh. Between him and its gates lay more enemies than his surviving warriors could kill with every round they possessed. He raised his blade. All units. The death shadows gathered around him. Some were wounded. Some were almost out of ammunition. None lowered their weapons. Mordath looked at the swarm closing from every direction. Their greatest victory on Sybari had lasted less than a minute. Now the price had come due. Return to the fortress. Drevor looked toward the impossible mass between them and Caradval. How? Mordath revved his blade. The teeth screamed. Through them. 46 minutes after the first confirmed ground assault, Caradval ceased to function as a fortress and became a collection of places where men were still killing. The distinction mattered. Fortresses possessed walls, command chains, fields of fire, reserves and depths into which defenders might withdraw. Caradval still possessed walls in places, but no geometry connected them. Whole sectors had vanished beneath collapsed masonry or chitinous bodies. Transit arteries terminated in rubble. Armories burned. Generatoriums flickered between power and darkness. Vox repeaters transmitted simultaneously across channels that no longer agreed on which units existed. What had once been a single defensive machine had shattered into dozens of isolated engagements, each warrior or squad fighting only what could reach them before something else arrived from another direction. Mordath heard the collapse through his helm. Eastern. Stairwell holding. Need ammunition at breach 7. Negative. Route lost. Contact beneath us. Lascannon. Second arch. Second arch. Where is command? Command. This is Val section. Static consumed the rest. Another voice replaced it immediately, mortal and screaming. They are through. They are through the floor. Bolter fire hammered behind the transmission. A wet impact. Then nothing. Mordath fought his way toward the central fortress with 17 death shadows remaining from the counterstroke. They no longer advanced as a coherent spearhead. The swarm had forced them apart within minutes. 3 warriors held a collapsed transit entrance to the north. Drevor and 4 Havocs had taken position among the ruins of an artillery tower. Mordath himself moved with 6 warriors through a defensive trench half filled with corpses. Others existed only as intermittent voices over the Vox. Every voice was an island. Every silence marked a sinking one. A living projectile struck the trench wall beside Mordath and burst against the ferrocrete. The thing inside it unfolded as it died, a pale mass of teeth and tendrils splashing corrosive fluid across the stones. One drop struck the edge of Mordath's damaged pauldron. Ceramite smoked. Artillery organisms, one of his warriors said. I see them. Beyond the trench, through smoke and drifting spores, vast bioforms pulsed behind the advancing broods. Their bodies flexed around swollen weapon organs. Each convulsion launched another living payload into the fortress. The death shadows had learned quickly what happened when those projectiles landed. Some burst into acid, some scattered smaller organisms, some drove living ammunition through armor and left it chewing inside the wound. Mordath raised his bolt pistol and pointed toward the distant shapes. "Dravor, your guns." The Havoc captain answered through gunfire. "No line. Create one." "Working." A thunderous autocannon burst came from somewhere beyond the ruined tower. The Tyranid front ranks erupted. Dravor's squad had established itself on the remains of an elevated defense platform. 5 heavy weapons looked down across a broad avenue where the swarm had packed itself so densely that aiming was almost unnecessary. The Havocs did not fire indiscriminately. They had no ammunition for indulgence. One autocannon fired short bursts into larger organisms, forcing their way through the lesser broods. A missile launcher waited for clustered targets before sending a warhead downrange. 2 heavy bolters fired only when the swarm approached the platform itself. A Lascanon team searched the haze for command beasts and artillery forms. Around them, ammunition servitors died one by one. The first lost its upper body to a living projectile that struck the platform edge and exploded into barbed fragments. The servitor's legs remained upright for several seconds, continuing to walk against the commands burned into its ruined nervous system until the corpse toppled. Another servitor dragged an autocannon drum toward Dravor. A winged organism dropped upon it. Claws punctured the servitor's back housing and pulled outward. Metal casing opened. Organic tissue stretched between cables. The creature tore the servitor in half, then lifted its head as Dravor's bolt pistol fired. The shell entered through one eye. The skull detonated. Dravor kicked the carcass from the ammunition drum. "Load." His gunner did. No one looked at the servitor again. The Havocs carved avenues through the swarm. Thousands came. They killed hundreds. The arithmetic had become obscene. "Autocannon reserve," Dravor demanded. A warrior checked. 2 drums. "Missiles?" 6. "Heavy bolters?" "Less than 1 belt each." Dravor stared across the avenue. Lesser organisms raced through the corpse fields. He raised one gauntlet. "Do not fire." The heavy bolters fell silent. A warrior looked toward him. "They are closing. Let them." The brood reached the first barricade. "Still hold." They climbed. Another 100 paces. Dravor watched larger shapes emerge behind them. "Now." The Havocs ignored the lesser creatures. Autocannon shells struck the larger beasts. A Lascanon beam bored through one command creature and burned into the organism behind it. The missile launcher fired twice. 1. Warhead struck a gun beast beneath its swollen thorax and tore the weapon organ away in a spray of smoking flesh. The smaller organisms reached the platform. The Havocs drew sidearms. Heavy weapons continued firing over their shoulders, while bolt pistols killed the creatures clawing onto the position. One gaunt climbed the parapet. A Havoc crushed its skull beneath his boot. Another seized his ankle. The warrior fired downward until the creature's upper body became red pulp. Still, the heavy guns did not turn. Dravor understood the economy now. Lesser creatures cost pistol rounds. Larger ones cost shells. Everything had become expenditure. The swarm answered with its own economy. The artillery organisms fired. Living projectiles crossed overhead. One struck the Havoc position. The explosion was not flame, it was organisms. Dozens of fist-sized things burst outward, landed across armor and stone and began biting. One Havoc slapped 3 from his breastplate before a 4th reached beneath his gorget. He roared. The creature disappeared into the seal. His neck bulged. Something moved beneath the skin. He tore his helm away. Blood poured from his mouth. Dravor seized him by the throat and fired a bolt pistol through the side of his head before whatever lived inside him reached the skull. The corpse fell. The autocannon beside it stopped firing. Dravor took the weapon himself. Below, fast organisms exploited the interruption instantly. They rushed the silent sector. Not randomly. Exactly there. The death shadows had seen the pattern too many times now to deny it. The artillery pushed defenders from cover. The faster broods entered the opening. The larger creatures arrived after them. The swarm fought as one ecosystem. Mordath understood that while retreating through the trench. A massive organism struck the parapet ahead and crashed through ferrocrete thick enough to stop a battle tank. Lesser beasts came through the hole beneath its limbs. Bolters opened. The large creature absorbed the first volley. The smaller ones did not. Bodies burst beneath mass-reactive rounds, but the monster kept coming. Mordath charged it. His blade struck the damaged carapace along its forelimb. The chain teeth caught. The creature swung. Mordath ducked beneath the limb and drove the weapon deeper. A death shadow beside him fired a melter weapon at near-contact range. White heat consumed half the creature's torso. The dying beast collapsed forward. Mordath barely cleared it. Behind them, the lesser swarm was already climbing across the corpse. Move. They moved. Above the trench, a mortal lieutenant was trying to make frightened men remember obedience. "Back to the wall!" he screamed. His name was Castor Ven, though no death shadow had spoken it in years. To them, he was merely the commander of the Eastern Auxiliaries. Men ran past him. Ven shot the first through the spine. The last pistol burned into the man's back. He fell face first. A second deserter stopped. Ven seized him by the collar. "You run again, and I will have your soul nailed to the gate." The soldier stared at him. Behind Ven, the sky writhed. "Back to your position." The soldier looked toward the trench, then toward the swarm. Something in his expression changed. Not courage, understanding. "You cannot nail anything to anything anymore." Ven shot him through the face. The others stopped, for perhaps 5 seconds. Then a section of wall collapsed behind them. Tyranids came through. The soldiers ran again. Ven killed 2. The rest ignored him. Some prayed as they fled. "To the gods! Hear us! Hear!" A claw opened one man's throat. Another dropped his rifle and knelt before a blackened shrine embedded in the fortress wall. "Great powers, deliver!" A living projectile struck the shrine. The explosion removed the man from the waist upward. Others ran toward the nearest death shadows. "Protect us!" The Astartes did not even turn. One mortal grabbed a warrior's arm. "Lord, please." The death shadow struck him aside with enough force to break his neck. There was no protection, no covenant, no reward for loyalty. The death shadows had ruled through terror, because terror implied a choice. Obey and live, disobey and suffer. That structure had collapsed. Now obedience and defiance led to the same mouth. The mortals understood it before. Their masters did. Some still fought, not for chaos, not for Sybari, not because they believed survival possible. They fired because their rifles still had charge. When the cells died, so did they. Deep beneath the battlefield, Karvek prepared his final equation. He had reached Reactor Annex Kappa by moving through maintenance arteries no longer represented on the fortress network. Half his mechadendrites were damaged. One dragged uselessly behind him, its joints severed. His left leg had lost most motor function. Hydraulic fluid leaked down the greave. The reactor before him still worked. That made it beautiful. Its containment housings vibrated beneath the floor. Power flowed through conduits toward defense systems that barely existed anymore. Karvek opened a channel. "Mordath, speak. I have control of the eastern geothermal core." Mordath stopped moving. "What can you do?" "Remove a district." "How much of one?" "All of it." The implications required no explanation. "How many of ours?" Karvek accessed the surviving friendly runes. 14 death shadows, approximately 12,000 mortal signatures. Mordath looked toward the eastern skyline. Tyranids covered it. "Do it." No hesitation. Karvek appreciated that. Authorization accepted. He broke the safeguards. Machine spirits screamed across the local network. Warning runes turned crimson. Automated systems demanded confirmation. Karvek gave it. Again. Again. Containment pressure rose. Coolant shut down. The core began eating itself. An alarm sounded throughout the eastern fortress sector. The mortals heard it first. Some knew what it meant. Most did not. The death shadows remaining there understood. One warrior laughed over the vox. About time. Another said nothing. A third continued firing. Karvek watched the temperature climb. Then the eastern quarter became light. The explosion tore upward through Karad Val. Towers vanished from their foundations. Ferrocrete liquefied. Thousands of Tyranids ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. Whole broods became vapor. Larger creatures were thrown through buildings as charred carcasses. The ground opened. Molten stone erupted through fractured plazas. The shockwave struck Mordath hard enough to force him against the trench wall. A moment later came the sound. It was not thunder. It was the fortress dying. Sections of Karad Val folded inward. Defense towers leaned, collided and collapsed in avalanches of masonry. Burning Tyranid bodies fell from the sky. For several seconds, death shadows cheered over the vox. Then the cheers began cutting out. The blast had killed the enemy. It had also erased the walls that had contained them. New breaches opened across the fortress. The surviving swarm moved toward them. Karvek saw this through failing Auspex feeds. He had expected it. He simply no longer possessed another machine large enough to kill. Something struck the reactor annex door. Once. Twice. Karvek turned. The third blow tore it inward. A large Tyranid entered through steam and smoke. Karvek fired a built-in weapon. The creature lost part of its head. It kept moving. Smaller organisms came beneath it. Karvek's remaining mechadendrites struck. One crushed a skull. Another cut through a forelimb. The large creature hit him. His breastplate split. The blow tore 3 cables from his abdomen. Machine fluid and blood spilled together. Karvek staggered. A smaller organism leapt onto his back. Its claws ripped into the interface ports along his spine. Warning symbols flooded his vision. Motor function degrading. Primary power coupling severed. Left optic gone. Another creature seized one mechadendrite and tore it from its mounting. Metal ripped. Wires stretched. For perhaps the first time in his existence, Karvek experienced the body he had engineered, not as improvement, but as inventory being dismantled. His right leg failed. He dropped to one knee. The large creature struck again. His remaining arm came away at the elbow. Karvek looked at the limb on the floor. He felt almost insulted. Then the swarm covered him. Claws forced between armor plates. Mandibles cut through cable bundles. One creature tore open the augmetic housing along his ribs and pulled an internal assembly free while it still pulsed with current. Karvek did not scream. He used the last functioning processor within his armor to compile the data. Sybari, surviving fortifications, ammunition, known Tyranid vectors, projected defensive endurance. Every tactical branch returned the same result. He transmitted it. Then jaws closed around his remaining eye. Mordath received the burst while standing beneath a sky full of ash. No voice accompanied it. No farewell. No oath. Only machine data. His helm processed the warpsmith's final calculation. Defensive Scenario 1, failure. Defensive Scenario 2, failure. Withdrawal Scenario, failure. Consolidation Scenario, failure. Counterattack Scenario, failure. Every projected path ended the same way. No surviving defense scenario produced victory. Mordath read the conclusion once, then erased the display. Around him, Karad Val continued to collapse. Karvek had spent centuries replacing flesh with machinery because he believed machinery could make truth precise. In the end, it had. Sybari was dead. Only the killing remained. 51 minutes after the first confirmed ground assault, what remained of the death shadows began converging upon the central redoubt of Karad Val. They came through smoke, collapsing galleries and corridors choked with bodies. Some arrived in disciplined squads. Others came alone. A predator with half its turret missing crawled into the inner courtyard on one functioning track, dragging a curtain of sparks behind it, while 3 death shadows walked beside the crippled machine and fired into anything following. Rhinos entered with doors hanging open and armor peeled back from repeated impacts. One carried wounded Astartes instead of troops, black-armored giants sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark troop bay, while blood drained from ruptured seals and gathered beneath their boots. Mortal soldiers came behind them in diminishing columns, some still carrying laser guns, others dragging ammunition crates because an overseer had ordered them to do so before being killed. No one asked how many had survived. The answer was visible in the space between them. Mordath watched from the inner command platform as every surviving unit was admitted through the western gate. Dravor arrived with 4 Havocs. He had begun the assault with more. No one commented upon the absence. A death shadow limped behind them, with one side of his torso blackened by acid. Another carried the severed arm of a fallen brother, because the progenoid organs within the corpse had not yet been recovered, and the apothecarian had ceased to exist. Gene seed, ammunition, weapons, living warriors, those were the assets that mattered now. Every other category had collapsed. The outer Vox channels were almost entirely dead. Caradval's surviving systems reported movement everywhere, beneath the redoubt, above it, inside abandoned sectors, across the walls. The central fortress was not safe. It was simply the last place where enough death shadows still stood together for the word defense to retain meaning. "Close the gate," Mordath ordered. The command officer beside the controls hesitated. "There are still men outside." Mordath looked toward the pict screen. Hundreds of mortals were running across the western approach. Soldiers, armory workers, servants, ammunition bearers and fugitives from lower levels. Some carried wounded comrades. Others carried nothing. They had seen the inner gate open and interpreted it as salvation. Behind them, through smoke and falling ash, movement filled the avenue. "Close it." The officer obeyed. The blast doors began descending. Men saw them move. The entire crowd accelerated. The first reached the threshold and threw himself through. Another followed, then 10 more. A wounded soldier stumbled. The man behind him stepped on his back and kept running. The gap narrowed. Someone outside screamed, "Hold!" The doors continued down. Hands reached beneath them. One mortal tried to crawl through after the opening had become too small. The edge struck his spine and crushed him against the deck. His legs remained outside. His upper body lay within, both arms clawing at the floor while blood flooded from his mouth. The doors finished sealing. The impact cut him in half. His torso twitched twice, then stopped. The pounding began immediately. Hundreds of fists and rifle stocks hammered against the outer surface. "Open! By the gods! Let us in!" The sound came through the reinforced gate as a dull, frantic thunder. Mordath stood before the external pict feed. The mortals outside turned. The first Tyranids hit them. The camera image became chaos. Bodies collided. Las fire flashed. A gaunt leapt into the crowd and vanished beneath men for an instant before claws emerged through a soldier's chest. Another creature struck from above. Something larger entered from the smoke and swept 3 mortals aside with one limb, breaking them against the wall. The sealed defenders watched. A man reached the gate camera and pressed both palms against the armor glass housing. His mouth formed words no one could hear. A claw entered his back. It emerged through his sternum. The man's eyes widened. The organism dragged him away. Blood coated the lens. Another body struck it, then another. Within seconds, the entire external feed became red-black movement and wet smears. The pounding on the gate stopped. Mordath turned away. "Count ammunition." No one spoke for several heartbeats. Then the work began. It was the quietest Caradval had been since the assault started. Death shadows opened magazine pouches and placed surviving bolt magazines upon stone ledges. Havocs checked belts and drums. Mortal armorers counted plasma cells with blood-covered hands. Flamer canisters were weighed. Missile tubes were opened and inspected. A surviving Rhino surrendered its stored ammunition to infantry squads. The damaged Predator possessed 27 usable autocannon rounds and fewer heavy bolter shells than Dravor considered worth mentioning. Mordath listened to the reports. 8 full bolt magazines. 6. 4 and partial. 2 plasma cells. 1 functioning melter gun. Charge reserve approximately half. Flamer fuel for 3 sustained discharges. 5 missiles. Autocannon reserve 27 rounds. A death shadow at the far end of the chamber held up a damaged magazine. 11 shells. Dravor looked toward him. 11 kills, then. The warrior locked it into his bolter. The mortal troops had even less. Many lasgun cells had been depleted during the retreat. Some soldiers carried weapons stripped from corpses. Ammunition distribution had become so uneven that one squad had nearly a dozen charged cells, while another possessed 3 between 20 men. Mordath looked across them. This was what remained of years of preparation for Ultramar. An army intended to burn worlds had become a room counting cartridges. Ranges, he said. The floor of the redoubt's main access hall had already been marked. Firing lines had been measured from the primary gate to 3 successive defensive positions. Rubble had been moved into barricades. Heavy weapons occupied elevated recesses. Flamers waited behind the second line where the corridor narrowed. Mordath addressed the death shadows first. No fire beyond designated range unless the target is command-capable or heavy enough to breach the barricades. Lesser organisms cross the first marker untouched. Bolters fire only within kill distance. Heavy weapons ignore lesser forms unless they mass sufficiently to justify expenditure. Plasma and melter fire only upon targets that cannot be killed by anything cheaper. No one objected. He turned toward the mortals. You will fire when ordered. One man swallowed. What if they reach us? Mordath looked at him. Then you have learned what your rifle was for. The gate shook. Once. Dust fell from the ceiling. Again. A fracture appeared along one hinge housing. Dravor checked his autocannon. First line. The death shadows moved into position. The mortals formed behind them. The gate shook a third time. Something outside screamed. Then came a grinding impact that bent the center of the blast door inward. The death shadows did not fire. The gap opened slowly. Claws appeared first. Then jaws. A lesser organism forced its head through and snapped at empty air. It crossed the first marker. No one fired. Another followed. Then 5. Then 20. The creatures spread across the entrance hall. Mortal troops trembled behind their weapons. One began whispering a prayer. Mordath watched distance runes. The swarm reached the second marker. Bolters. The hall exploded with fire. Disciplined volleys struck at chest height. The first rank of Tyranids disappeared. Mass reactive rounds detonated inside bodies and threw pieces backward. A creature lost both forelimbs and half its thorax before being trampled by those behind. Another took a shell through the skull and sprayed the ceiling with fragments of brain and chitin. The death shadows did not shoot faster. They shot better. Each bolt was placed. Each target died. The swarm packed itself into the corridor. Autocannon, Dravor fired. 3-round bursts punched tunnels through the mass. A larger organism appeared behind the lesser broods. Missile. 1 warhead launched. The explosion tore the creature open from throat to abdomen and showered the hall in steaming organs. Still, the Tyranids came. They filled the breach. Bodies accumulated. The dead began slowing the living. Mordath waited. Flame. Promethium washed across the mound. The entire entrance became fire. Tyranids burned where they stood. Some continued crawling while their outer flesh blackened. Others ruptured as heat reached internal cavities. Burning fluids ran between the bodies and pooled against the gate. The smell entered even sealed armor systems. Cooked meat, acid, propellant. The death shadows kept firing. The first assault died inside the breach. For several seconds, nothing moved. A mortal soldier laughed. It was a small sound. Another joined him. Then several began shouting. Dravor turned his helm. Silence. The shouting stopped. The corpse mound shifted. A claw emerged from beneath it. Then another. Fresh organisms were tunneling through the dead. Smaller beasts pushed between ruptured torsos. Others climbed over the top. The mound rose as something large moved beneath it. Mordath watched the dead become architecture again. Secondary line. The death shadows withdrew in order. The Tyranids pushed inward. A larger creature entered the breach behind them, using its armored head and forelimbs to shove the corpse pile forward. Bodies slid across the floor in a wet mass. The dead became a ramp over the first barricade. Fire! Bolters hammered again. The creature absorbed the first volley. Dravor's autocannon struck its shoulder. The rounds cracked the carapace. A plasma weapon fired. White-blue energy struck the fracture and burned through. The beast collapsed. Lesser organisms climbed over it immediately. Mordath saw the pattern. Everything they killed became material. Cover, ramps, obstructions that harmed defenders more than attackers. The death shadows fell back another 20 paces. Now the fighting became intimate. The survivors had spent centuries perfecting violence, not the desperate violence of mortals, not rage without technique, the old deliberate violence of transhuman killers. A death shadow fired 2 bolt rounds into one creature, pivoted, drew his chainsword, and cut another across the abdomen before the first body hit the ground. Dravor fired his autocannon until the final drum emptied, dropped the weapon without ceremony, and drew a chain axe. Another warrior used a power fist to crush a gaunt against the wall, then seized the corpse and hurled it into the swarm behind. Mordath fought in the center. His damaged shoulder screamed with every strike. He ignored it. A creature leapt toward his face. He caught it on his blade and ripped downward. Chitin opened. Organs spilled across his breastplate. Another reached him before the first had fallen. Its claw struck his abdomen and scraped across ceramite. He fired into its eye. The skull burst. A third creature bit into his forearm. He smashed it against the barricade until the jaws broke. Around him, death shadows died slowly. One warrior was dragged beneath the corpse ramp. Mordath saw his hand emerge through bodies, still holding a bolt pistol. He fired 3 times from beneath the pile. Then the hand vanished. Another lost the lower half of one leg and continued fighting from one knee until a larger beast struck him through the chest. The claw emerged from his back, carrying a section of spine. He fired his last bolt round into the creature's face before it tore him apart. Centuries vanished every few seconds. Mordath understood the obscenity of it. These were warriors who had killed imperial officers before their grandfathers were born. Warriors who remembered worlds no longer represented on star charts. Warriors whose armor contained repairs older than entire mortal dynasties. Behemoth spent organisms against them without distinction. 1 death shadow, 100 gaunts, 1,000. Whatever number solved the problem. The redoubt shook again. A communication servitor screamed through its vox grill. Long-range transmission aperture restored. Mordath turned. A mortal signal officer stared at his console. For how long? Unknown. Open it. The officer worked frantically. Static filled the chamber. Mordath looked at the system data. Beyond the shadow lay Ultramar, the destination of every weapon they had prepared, the empire they had intended to wound. He could warn it. The thought disgusted him. That did not make it irrational. Transmit all available tactical records, he ordered. Unknown Xenos fleet, biological vessels, planetary consumption, numbers beyond conventional fleet scale, include picked records and contact behavior. The officer sent the burst. The signal entered the dark. Static swallowed it. Again. He tried. The waveform collapsed. Again. The astropathic relay emitted a sound like a dying animal. Blood began running from the signal servitor's eyes. Nothing is carrying beyond the system, the officer said. Mordath stared at the dead channel. The irony was almost worthy of a god. He had spent years planning how to silence Ultramar. Now, at the end, he could not make himself heard. A catastrophic impact struck the primary gate. The entire redoubt shook. The corpse ramp shifted. Another impact followed. The metal screamed. Something immense pushed through. The gate tore apart. A monstrous Tyranid entered amid twisting slabs of adamantium. Its head was protected by a layered carapace thick enough to turn bolter fire. Its shoulders filled most of the breach. One forelimb struck the barricade and shattered it. The firing geometry vanished. Plasma! The remaining plasma weapon fired. The shot burned into the creature's chest. It kept coming. Melter! The melter gun discharged. Part of its neck became incandescent vapor. Still it moved. Dravor charged. His chain axe struck the damaged tissue. The creature hit him with one limb and threw him across the hall. Mordath fired his final bolt magazine into the wound. The beast staggered. Then lesser organisms flooded around its legs. The carefully prepared lanes were gone. The barricades no longer mattered. The death shadows drew blades. The mortals broke. Some ran deeper into the fortress. Others fired wildly. The Tyranids entered among them. One soldier disappeared beneath claws. Another was bitten through the shoulder and lifted screaming from the floor. His arm tore free before the creature dropped him. Mordath looked toward the final inner doors. They were still sealed. Beyond them lay the command sanctum, the last enclosed space. They could retreat again. They could close another door, count another handful of rounds, wait for the swarm to dig through floor, wall, or ceiling, die in darkness. He rejected it. Open the inner gates. The command officer stared at him. My lord, open them. That exposes the sanctum. The sanctum is already dead. The officer obeyed. The final blast doors of Karadval began to rise. Dravor climbed back to his feet. Blood ran from one side of his armor. He looked toward Mordath. You invite them in. Mordath discarded his empty bolt pistol. He took his blade in both hands. The chain teeth screamed to life. No! The doors rose higher. Beyond them waited the ruined command plaza and the last chambers of the fortress. Mordath looked at the Tyranid mass pouring through the broken gate. We deny them the pleasure of digging us out. The death shadows gathered around him. The final doors opened completely. Mordath stepped forward. If Sybari is to become our tomb, he said, then let it have no lid. 57 minutes after the first confirmed ground assault, Karadval had become too small for strategy. There were no sectors left worth naming. No reserves remained to be repositioned. No ammunition train moved through the fortress. No armored column waited behind another wall. The tactical display still attempted to assign designations to breaches, corridors, and defensive zones, but the designations no longer described anything that existed. Walls had collapsed into chambers. Chambers had opened into courtyards. Courtyards had filled with bodies until the dead altered the shape of the ground. Vox channels carried commands toward warriors who had already been killed and requests for ammunition from positions whose magazines burned beneath tons of stone. Mordath stopped listening to most of it. What mattered was closer. Claws against ceramite, bolter chambers locking forward, chainsword motors screaming beneath the roar of the swarm. The last death shadows had opened the inner gates of their own fortress, and Behemoth came through them. Mordath charged first. The remaining heretic Astartes followed. They met the Tyranids in the inner courtyard, at a range where firearms ceased to be ranged weapons. Mordath fired his captured bolt pistol into the face of the first organism before it had fully cleared the broken archway. The shell entered beneath one eye and detonated inside the skull, spraying fragments of chitin and pulped neural tissue across his gauntlet. He stepped through the falling body and drove his chainsword into the thorax of the creature behind it. The weapon teeth caught on armor, shrieked, then chewed through. Dark organs spilled across the stone. Around him, the death shadows struck with the violence of warriors who had lived too long to waste motion. Bolters fired from the hip at near-contact range. Astartes shot through one creature to kill another behind it. Chainswords ground against carapace until teeth snapped. Power blades entered joints and left limbs twitching upon the ground. A death shadow seized a lesser organism by the skull and crushed it against his knee before another creature buried talons into the flexible armor beneath his arm. He ignored the wound, fired twice into the attacker's chest, then ripped the claws free from his own body with flesh still caught around them. The swarm closed. There was no room to form firing lines, no room to withdraw. Every warrior became his own fortress. Dravor stood beside the last functioning heavy bolter. The weapon had been dragged into the courtyard on a broken mount. 2 ammunition belts remained when the inner doors opened. Now, there was less than 1. Dravor fired in controlled bursts despite everything. Each burst tore lesser organisms apart and struck larger creatures behind them. The gun bucked beneath his hands. Spent casings accumulated around his boots. A mortal loader crouched behind the ammunition box until a living projectile struck him through the shoulder and burst inside his chest. The man's ribcage opened outward. Blood splashed across the feed tray. Dravor kicked the corpse aside. He fed the belt himself. The heavy bolter continued firing. A monstrous organism forced its way through the gate. Its carapace was scarred from previous impacts. One forelimb ended in a hooked blade longer than a mortal man. Dravor shifted aim. The remaining belt shortened. Bolts struck the creature's chest. One exploded, then another. The beast continued. "Come farther," Dravor growled. It did. The heavy bolter fired again. The creature's left shoulder ruptured. It kept moving. Dravor laughed through his Vox grill, not because he found anything amusing, because hatred still understood laughter. He fired until the belt ended. The heavy bolter clicked. For the first time since the assault began, the weapon fell silent. Dravor looked at the empty feed tray, then at the creature charging him. He tore the heavy bolter from its mount. The gun was almost as long as a mortal man and built to be fired from reinforced positions. Dravor lifted it in both hands and swung. The barrel struck the Tyranid across the skull. Chitin cracked. The creature recoiled. Dravor struck again. The heavy bolter housing dented. A third blow broke part of the creature's jaw. Then claws entered Dravor's side. The first tore through the armor beneath his ribs. The second hooked beneath the edge of his breastplate. Dravor rammed the ruined gun into the beast's mouth. Another Tyranid struck from behind. A blade punched through his back and emerged beneath his sternum. Dravor remained standing. He turned with the impaling limb still inside him and smashed the heavy bolter into the attacker's face. The gun finally broke. So did Dravor's left hand. 2 fingers remained attached by strips of flesh inside the gauntlet. He looked down at the damage. Then another claw punched through his abdomen. The Death Shadow's captain gave one final mechanical laugh. The swarm pulled him apart. Mordath saw the heavy bolter fall. He understood what it meant. No heavy weapons remained. Organized fire support had ended. From this moment onward, every Death Shadow killed with what he could carry in his hands. The mortals had almost vanished. A few still fought along the courtyard edges, but they no longer existed as units. One soldier fired a laser gun until the cell overheated, dropped it, and picked up another weapon from a corpse. A second mortal knelt behind a broken statue and prayed between shots. A third ran without direction, both hands pressed against an abdominal wound, through which intestine protruded between his fingers. The Tyranids barely noticed them. That was when Mordath understood another pattern. Larger organisms were no longer pursuing the mortals. They were coming for the Astartes. He saw one towering beast ignore 3 wounded soldiers lying within reach and turn directly toward a death shadow fighting 20 paces away. Smaller broods behaved similarly. They flowed around dying mortals when a black-armored warrior remained nearby. The swarm had measured resistance. It knew where resistance lived. Not in the wounded slaves, not in the scattered soldiers. In them. Every surviving death shadow had become a marked point within the hive mind's battlefield. Mordath almost admired the precision. Then the towering organism reached Brother Valek. Valek had already lost part of his helm and half his left pauldron. Blood covered one side of his face. He fired 3 bolts upward. The beast struck him with both forelimbs. The first blow shattered his pelvis. The second drove him into the ground. His lower body disappeared beneath the creature's weight. Mordath heard armor crack. Valek roared. He did not die. The Tyranid shifted. Valek's legs folded beneath him at impossible angles. Bone punched through torn armor seals. Blood spread beneath his body. He raised his bolter. The muzzle touched the creature's abdomen. He fired. Once, twice, again. The rounds detonated inside the beast. Dark blood poured over him. Valek kept firing. The magazine emptied. The creature tore open. Part of its abdomen collapsed across the trapped Astartes. Lesser Tyranids came around it. Valek drew his combat knife. He stabbed the first through the throat. A second bit into his forearm. He cut through its jaw. A third seized his shoulder. Then 5 more covered him. His lower body remained crushed beneath the dead monster, while the swarm began dismantling the rest. Valek stabbed until something tore away the hand holding the knife. He headbutted another organism. Claws entered his throat. One creature seized his exposed lower jaw and pulled. The flesh tore. Valek still moved. Only when 2 organisms pulled his torso in opposite directions and the spine came apart did the death shadow stop fighting. There was nothing noble in it. No witness to remember. No standard raised above him. He simply required dismemberment before his body accepted death. Another warrior died 20 paces away. Brother Kadros lost his right arm to a scything strike. The limb spun across the courtyard, still gripping his chainsword. Kadros stared at the stump. Blood erupted from the broken seal. A smaller Tyranid leapt. He caught it with his remaining hand and drove it into the stone hard enough to split its head. More came. Kadros reached toward his belt. His fingers closed around a grenade. Mordath saw him pull the arming mechanism with his teeth. Kadros. The warrior looked toward him. No farewell passed between them. None was required. Kadros shoved the grenade into the open thoracic cavity of the nearest creature. The swarm covered him. The detonation lifted bodies from the courtyard. Fragments of chitin struck Mordath's armor. Kadros disappeared. So did the organisms around him. For a heartbeat there was a hole in the swarm. Then it closed. Mordath fought toward the command plaza. He did not choose the route. The battle pushed him there. A claw tore across his breastplate and opened an old repair seam. Another organism struck his wounded shoulder. Pain flashed white across his vision. He killed it. A larger creature seized his sword arm. Mordath fired into its knee. The leg broke. He wrenched free. His blade caught in a second beast's skull. He placed one boot against its chest and tore the weapon loose. Behind him, another death shadow screamed. Mordath did not turn. The scream stopped. The ruined inner sanctum opened ahead. He entered beneath a collapsed archway. The chamber where Malifaux had once planned the assault upon Ultramar still existed in fragments. Captured Imperial banners burned along the walls. The broken aquila mounted above the strategium had fallen and shattered upon the floor. One severed eagle head lay beneath a Tyranid corpse. The hololith still functioned, barely. It flickered through smoke and dust, its projector damaged, the image bending each time the fortress trembled. Ultramar glowed above the ruined table. Campaign routes still marked the void. Targets remained highlighted. Astropathic stations, fuel depots, defense nexuses. And there, at the heart of the display, Macragga. Mordath stopped. For less than a second. He remembered the confidence of that chamber before Behemoth came. Malifaux, speaking as though the future had already surrendered. Karvek, complaining about defense systems, stripped for invasion. Dravor, threatening mortal crews into faster embarkation. Night Reaver waiting beneath the hangar lights. All dead now, or near enough. Macragga continued glowing. The blue world they had intended to wound. The fortress of the Emperor's favored sons. Mordath hated it still. Nothing Behemoth had done altered that. He had not become wiser. He had not discovered virtue. There would be no final revelation in which hatred left him. He still wanted Ultramar to burn, still despised the corpse upon Terra, still remembered every Imperial banner he had watched fall and every Imperial warrior he had killed with satisfaction. The Tyranids had not redeemed him. They had simply arrived first. Movement filled the entrance behind him. Mordath turned. Tyranids entered the sanctum. He fired. His bolt pistol clicked empty after 2 shots. Mordath looked at it, discarded it. One creature charged across the hololithic projection. He cut it in half. The image of Ultramar flickered through the spray of alien blood. Another came from the side. He drove his shoulder into it and shoved it against the strategium table. His blade entered beneath its jaw. The chain teeth tore upward through the skull. The body collapsed across the hololith. Macragga glowed through the corpse. Mordath stared at it, then raised his sword. He brought the weapon down upon the projector. The hololith exploded. Glass and circuitry burst across the table. Macragga vanished. Ultramar disappeared. The campaign died with the machine. The darkness left behind lasted only a heartbeat before emergency lumens painted the chamber red. Mordath turned toward the swarm. More organisms entered. Behind them came larger shapes. They moved around the bodies of mortals without slowing. Toward him. Of course, he was still resistance. Mordath opened the warband command channel. Static answered. He transmitted anyway. "Death shadows," a voice returned. Faint. "Here. Another. Still killing." A third said nothing intelligible, only breathing and the sound of a chainsword. Mordath looked into the swarm. "This is Ver Mordath." A creature screamed. He revved his blade. "There is no withdrawal." Someone laughed across the vox. Another warrior said, "Good." Mordath stepped over the broken hololith. "There is no fortress." A distant bolter fired. One shot, then another. "There is no tomorrow." He could hear claws approaching from the rear now. The chamber had more than one entrance. He was being enclosed. Mordath tightened both hands around the sword. "But there is still an enemy." The swarm charged. So did he. His first strike took a creature through the shoulder and neck. He kept moving. A claw raked his thigh and opened the armor seal. Blood filled his boot. He killed the attacker. Another organism struck him in the chest. He staggered, did not fall. He rammed his sword through its mouth. The chain teeth burst from the back of its skull. More came. He lost sight of the walls, lost sight of the broken strategium, lost sight of everything except bodies. Black armor vanished beneath chitin. For a moment his blade remained visible, rising above the swarm and descending again. Once, twice. A flash of chain teeth. Another. Something enormous moved into the mass. The blade appeared again. Lower now. Blood sprayed upward. The swarm closed. For several seconds the weapon continued to flash within it. Then the light stopped. Less than an hour after the first confirmed ground assault, organized resistance on Sybari ceased. There was no final declaration. No command rune changed from red to black. No surviving officer transmitted surrender, because surrender required an enemy capable of accepting it. The last coherent Death Shadows Vox channels simply vanished one after another beneath static, gunfire, and the wet violence of things entering enclosed spaces. Karadval still burned. Weapons still discharged in isolated chambers where warriors who had never received Mordath's final transmission fought on alone. Somewhere beneath the western bastion, a bolter fired 3 times, paused, then fired once more before falling silent. In a collapsed generatorium, a wounded heretic Astartes, with both legs crushed beneath ferrocrete, killed 6 lesser organisms with a combat blade, before a 7th tore open the flexible armor beneath his throat. In another vault, a chain-axe motor screamed for several seconds after the hand gripping it had been severed from its owner. None of those deaths altered anything. The war, if the word still possessed meaning, was over. What followed was not war. It was feeding. A mortal soldier crawled through the ruins of the central ammunition district with one arm hanging useless beside him. His name did not matter. The uniform he wore no longer identified a functioning unit. Half the fabric had burned away, and the insignia upon his shoulder was hidden beneath blood and soot. He had spent most of his life fearing the death shadows. He had watched them execute men for sleeping at sentry posts, flay prisoners alive for instruction, and condemn entire labor gangs because one worker failed to meet a quota. For years he had imagined that death at their hands was the worst thing Sybari could contain. Now he dragged himself between the corpses of those same masters, while something small clicked through the dark behind him. He stopped breathing. The sound stopped too. He waited. Nothing. Then claws touched stone directly beside his head. The soldier rolled and fired his last pistol. The beam struck a pale feeder organism across the face. It spasmed and fell. 3 more came over the body. He fired again. 1 died. The weapon clicked. The soldier stared at it. A creature leapt. Its jaws closed over his wrist and crushed bone. He screamed, striking it with the dead pistol until another organism climbed onto his back. Claws entered beneath his ribs. A 3rd bit into the wound already torn through his shoulder. He tried to crawl. They ate while he was still moving. The same thing happened across the fortress. Survivors hid inside maintenance ducts until smaller organisms found them. Men sealed themselves inside armories and suffocated when corrosive secretions destroyed the ventilation systems. Slaves crawled beneath corpse piles and remained motionless while Tyranids passed overhead, only to discover that the creatures returning behind the assault were not searching for resistance, but flesh. Some mortals prayed when they heard them coming. Others cursed the dark gods. A few begged the emperor they had been taught to despise. None received an answer. The first feeder swarms entered the major corpse fields before the last isolated gunshots ended. They came in numbers that made the earlier attack broods seem selective. Small organisms poured across the dead like living carpets. They entered ruptured bodies through wounds, mouths, eye sockets, and shattered armor seals. They chewed muscle from bone, stripped organs from opened cavities, and disappeared beneath the rib cages of larger corpses. What they consumed did not remain within them. Biomass passed onward through the invasion ecology, broken down, transported, rendered useful. A death shadow lay against the remains of the eastern wall, with his breastplate split from throat to abdomen. The armor still carried old blasphemies carved into the ceramite. Brass chains hung from one pauldron. A broken imperial medal had been nailed to the chest as a trophy centuries earlier. The feeder organisms did not see any of it. One entered through the hole beneath his gorget. Another began chewing exposed tissue where a claw had opened his abdomen. A 3rd crawled across the symbol upon his shoulder without hesitation. 3 paces away lay the corpse of a mortal auxiliary. Farther beyond, a dead Tyranid had been torn open by autocannon fire. The feeder swarm consumed all 3: chaos flesh, human flesh, Tyranid flesh. Symbols did not survive digestion. The distinction between victor and defeated disappeared beneath mouths. Across Karadval's approaches, the corpse mountains began to shrink. The change was not immediate enough for mortal eyes to perceive from heartbeat to heartbeat, but the direction was unmistakable. What had been barricades of dead organisms collapsed inward as smaller creatures burrowed through them. Severed limbs vanished. Exposed organs were stripped away. Pools of blood disappeared beneath swarms. Even damaged Tyranid bodies were broken down and reclaimed. The battlefield was becoming material. Soon, even that was not enough. The first capillary structures rose from the ruins. They emerged through cracked stone and shattered plazas as pale towers of living tissue, thin at first, then thickening as more biomass flowed through them. Veins pulsed beneath translucent membranes. Root-like organs penetrated soil, sewer systems, corpse fields, and reservoirs. Where the structures touched stagnant water, the liquid changed color. Where they entered fuel-contaminated ground, smaller organisms gathered around them and continued working until whatever could be converted had been separated from whatever could not. Caradval had been built from ferrocrete, adamantium, plasteel, and hate. It had been designed to withstand bombardment. It had survived centuries of neglect, treachery, and siege preparation. Now organic towers rose around it because the enemy did not intend to occupy the fortress. It intended to dismantle the world beneath it. The difference was enormous. Conquerors preserved things. They needed roads, shelter, power, water, storage. A fortress captured intact remained useful. Behemoth required none of that. The remaining defense towers could collapse. The reactors could die. The roads could fracture. The oceans could become poison. The atmosphere itself could change. Every process that would have horrified a conventional occupying army was acceptable because there would be no occupation after the feeding ended. The scale widened beyond Caradval. Across the northern wastes, fortresses that had transmitted only minutes earlier now stood surrounded by living growth. Their walls had been breached from above and below. Mortal populations fled into tunnels, ash deserts and industrial ruins, only to encounter organisms already moving through those places. Farther south, entire labor cities vanished beneath spore clouds. The seas began to change. Dark shapes entered coastal waters in masses. Feeding organisms spread through poisoned shallows. Larger structures rose along shorelines. Rivers carried dissolved organic matter toward collection zones. Forests that had survived Sybari's industrial centuries became moving carpets of alien life. Creatures stripped leaves, bark, animals, fungi, and soil organisms with the same indifferent efficiency they applied to human corpses. What had seemed planetary during the battle was revealed to have been local. Caradval's fall had felt enormous because those dying inside it possessed no wider perspective. From above, the fortress was one wound among thousands. From orbit, even the continent was only part of a feeding pattern. The hive mind did not celebrate the destruction of the death shadows because celebration would have implied significance. There was none. In the ruined command sanctum, Malefor remained where he had fallen, or what remained of him did. His corpse had burned from within. Armor plates were cracked apart around the torso, and one side of the skull had been destroyed by Mordath's final bolt. Violet scorch marks stained the floor beneath him. The blackened remains of Vargul lay nearby, fused to melted ceramite. The chamber that had once made mortals tremble was filling with small things. Feeder organisms climbed over the broken altar. They passed through the ashes of burned ritual parchment. One disappeared inside a reliquary that had once contained the finger bones of an imperial saint. Another crawled across Malefor's chest. Nothing happened. No curse struck it. No demon manifested to defend the corpse. No voice from the warp proclaimed vengeance. The creature found exposed flesh beneath a fractured armor plate and began eating. Above it, captured imperial banners hung in burned strips. The severed heads of the old Aquila had fallen from their spikes. One lay beside a cracked strategium projector. Malefor's campaign maps were scattered across the floor beneath slime, blood, and spores. Routes toward Ultramar remained visible on several surviving. The organisms crawled over them. The plans meant nothing now. Sybari's hidden arsenals had mattered to the Death Shadows. Its gene seed vaults had mattered. Its trophies had mattered. Its fortresses had mattered. Its planned invasion of Ultramar had mattered. Every grievance that had consumed centuries of Heretic Astartes' existence had seemed immense because those warriors possessed minds capable of giving hatred history. Behemoth possessed history of another kind: migration, consumption, adaptation, movement. Sybari had not been a rival empire. It had not been a hated enemy. It had not even been an objective in the sense Mordath would have understood. The Hive fleet had entered the system and encountered biomass protected by weapons. The weapons had fired. The swarm had removed them. Nothing more was required. That was the cruelest truth left upon the planet. The Death Shadows had believed themselves participants in a great war. They had imagined Ultramar waiting at the end of their preparation. They had imagined acts of vengeance, sabotage, and desecration remembered by survivors. They had believed the galaxy contained space for their hatred. Behemoth had reduced all of that ambition to an inconvenience lasting less than an hour. The consumption continued. The atmosphere thickened beneath spores. Pools of digestive matter expanded across low ground. Organic structures pumped liquefied biomass toward towering capillary columns. Ripper-like feeders descended into vaults where bodies had accumulated. They stripped mortals first, because mortals were easier to reach, then turned upon the dead Astartes. Ceramite slowed them. It did not save what lay inside. In the courtyard where Dravor had fired the last heavy bolter, feeder organisms disappeared beneath his broken armor. His ruined weapon remained nearby. No hand would reclaim it. At the command plaza, the shattered hololith no longer displayed Macraga. Its projector had died where Mordath destroyed it. His body could not be distinguished from the mass around the ruined sanctum without digging through layers of alien dead. That too would change. The feeders would find him. Centuries of memory, battle skill, hatred, gene seed, muscle, blood, all of it would become chemistry. Above Sybari, the living ships continued their work. Great organic vessels hung in orbit, while streams of material rose from the surface through capillary processes vast enough to be seen from space. The planet beneath them dimmed as fires went out and atmospheric contamination thickened. Smaller void organisms moved between the larger bioships. Wounded creatures were absorbed where useful. Others drifted dead until feeder organisms reclaimed what could be reclaimed. The fleet had suffered losses. Those losses had meaning only insofar as they affected available biomass and the efficiency of the next movement. Sybari had provided compensation. The planet had populations, ecosystems, water, organic reserves. Enough life remained beyond the fortress zones to make the Death Shadows themselves almost irrelevant to the final accounting. The warband had been dangerous because it possessed weapons. Once those weapons were silenced, its bodies were merely part of the yield. Hours passed, then more. The last mortal transmissions became incoherent. A mining settlement on the far side of the planet broadcast a distress message toward a sky it could no longer see. The signal repeated automatically after everyone inside the transmission room died. A coastal fortress sent only coordinates. A subterranean labor city transmitted prayers. No message crossed the shadow. No distant ally came. No renegade fleet translated into the system. No servant of the Imperium heard enough to understand what had happened. The galaxy beyond Sybari continued turning in ignorance. That ignorance would not last. The feeding eventually began to diminish. Not because mercy had entered the swarm, because the work was nearing completion. The great concentrations of organisms shifted toward reclamation zones. Living ships adjusted position above the world. Capillary structures continued draining what remained. The seas receded. Atmosphere changed. Regions that had once supported industry, slavery, and war became exposed scar tissue. Sybari had hidden the Death Shadows for years. Now there was almost nothing left to hide. The Hive fleet began moving again. Not all at once. Nothing so vast moved as a single vessel might. Outer organisms shifted first. Smaller bioships altered course. Larger masses followed. The living procession reorganized with the same unity that had governed every attack upon the fortress world. Its direction led onward, toward richer systems, toward denser populations, toward Ultramar. The Death Shadows had intended to make that journey themselves. They had assembled ammunition for it, prepared aircraft for it, stored gene seed against the casualties they expected to suffer there. Malifaux had gazed into the warp seeking weaknesses in the realm of Guilliman's sons. Mordath had planned how populations might be terrorized before the first Astartes strike. Night Reaver had waited to carry killers beneath another world's sky. None of them would reach Ultramar. Behemoth would. The Hive fleet left behind a world that no longer possessed voices. No chains rattled in the slave vaults. No overseer shouted. No machine priest cursed failing engines. No bolter fired from the walls. No mortal screamed beneath a whip. No sorcerer lord whispered into the Empyrean. No death shadow promised suffering to an enemy. The last automatic Vox beacon continued transmitting from a buried communication station after the structure above it had collapsed. Its signal contained only static. Then the power cell failed. The transmission ended. Silence spread across Sybari. The fortress towers stood gutted beneath a poisoned sky for a little longer before the reclamation swarms reached them. The remaining capillary structures pulsed. The last bodies disappeared. The final traces of organized life vanished beneath the processes of consumption. Beyond the planet, the shadow moved with the fleet. Ahead lay worlds that did not yet know its name. Behind lay a stripped grave where an army had once prepared to make war upon Ultramar. Behemoth did not look back. Behemoth did not remember. Behemoth did not hate. It moved on, and it did not slow down.